The air in the church changed the moment I crossed the threshold, like a current had been cut. Conversations dimmed, mid-sentence eyes darted away, only to return with furtive glances, and necks craned to confirm what they couldn't quite believe. Some people gasped, audibly, small, sharp intakes of breath that punctuated the sudden silence. Others whispered my name, Eleanor, in hushed tones that made it sound like a transgression. Is that her? I can't believe she showed up. After everything that happened, it had been 15 years since most of them had seen me. 15 years of carefully constructed narratives about my absence. 15 years of speculation and judgment. And now here I was, standing at my ex-husband's funeral, like a storm cloud. No one had forecasted dressed in a simple navy dress that suddenly felt too conspicuous under their scrutiny. Richard Harrington, the man I had once called my husband, my partner. The father of my children lay in an open casket at the front of the church. From where I stood, I could see only the polished mahogany edge and the sea of white roses surrounding him. The funeral director had arranged everything with meticulous attention to aesthetic detail. Precisely spaced flower arrangements, tastefully dim lighting, and measured somber music, playing just loud enough to discourage complete silence, but soft enough to allow for reflection. Victoria sat front and center in the first pew, a tissue clutched delicately between manicured fingers, though I noticed it remained largely dry. Her blonde hair was expertly styled, her black dress appropriately, somber yet fashionable. Even in mourning, she managed to look like she'd stepped from the pages of a magazine, something I had never quite mastered during my 25 years with Richard. Beside Victoria sat my daughters Abigail and Sophia. My chest tightened at the sight of them. Abby, now 32, had Richard's sharp features and determined jawline. Her posture was rigid, controlled, her gaze fixed forward, as if sensing my presence but refusing to acknowledge it. Sophie, 29, softer in both appearance and temperament, stared at her hands folded in her lap, a wisp of her dark hair my hair had escaped her careful bun, and I watched as she tucked it behind her ear with a familiar gesture that made my heart ache. I knew I wasn't welcome. I knew this space had long stopped being mine, but I didn't come for them. I didn't come to make a scene or to stake a claim on grief that others might consider more rightfully theirs. I came because, despite everything Richard had done, despite the betrayal and the years of slow erasure he had once been my entire world, and part of me, perhaps the strongest part, the part that had finally learned to stand on its own, needed to see this through to mark the end of this chapter with my own eyes. As I walked slowly down the side aisle, conscious of every footfall against the worn carpet, people leaned into one another and whispered behind cupped hands. I caught fragments floating through the air like debris. Is that really Eleanor? After all these years, can you believe the nerve? Why would she even come? I heard she completely abandoned those girls. I didn't flinch, though. Each whispered assumption stung like salt in old wounds. Instead, I kept my head high, my back straight posture. I had practiced in the bathroom mirror for months after the divorce, when simply standing upright felt like a revolutionary act. I chose a pew near the back, deliberately maintaining distance from the immediate family, while quietly folding my coat beside me. The weight of eyes upon me was tangible. I felt like I was sitting on trial, but I wasn't ashamed. I wouldn't allow myself to be. They didn't know the whole story. Most never did. They had seen only what Richard had wanted them to see. The successful businessman, the community leader, the devoted father, who had somehow managed to soldier on after his difficult wife had inexplicably walked away from their perfect life. the minister approached the pulpit, a tall man with silver hair and practiced solemnity. He opened with words about legacy, about a life well lived, about the man Richard had been in the community. People nodded in solemn agreement, some dabbed at their eyes. I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. As the eulogy continued, memories I had long buried came rushing back with unexpected force. Our first Christmas in the little apartment above the bookstore. Richard's tie askew as he presented me with a small, wrapped box containing a silver bracelet we couldn't afford. The house in Millfield with its creaking porch swing, where I had spent countless evenings watching fireflies while pregnant with Abby. The girls learning to ride bikes on the sloped driveway, Richard running alongside them with one hand hovering protectively near their backs. And then the silence, the thick, suffocating silence that came in our last years together, when conversations became transactions and intimacy, a distant memory. The service progressed through hymns and remembrances. Richard's business partner spoke of his integrity and vision. A nephew shared an anecdote about a fishing trip that prompted gentle laughter. Victoria rose gracefully to thank everyone for coming, her voice steady and controlled. Through it all, I remained in my pew, an observer to this curated presentation of a life I had once been central to, but now barely recognized. Then, just when I thought the whispers might finally die down, a different figure approached the podium. James Wilson, Richard's longtime attorney, moved to the front with measured steps. Tall and lean in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, briefcase in hand, he adjusted his glasses and surveyed the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Good afternoon." He began, his voice calm but clear-cutting through the murmurs. "As many of you know, I served as Richard's legal counsel for nearly 30 years. While this is certainly an unorthodox addition to today's proceedings, I've been expressly asked to read a section of Richard Harrington's last will and testament." A ripple of confusion moved through the congregation. Victoria's back stiffened, visibly. Abby leaned toward her sister, whispering something urgent. James opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder bound with a black ribbon, the formality of the gesture somehow amplifying the tension in the room. "Before I begin," he continued, "I want to clarify that this was Richard's explicit request, documented and notarized 3 months before his passing. He specifically asked that this portion be read aloud at his funeral service, regardless of who might be in attendance." There was a pause long enough to tense every shoulder in the room. James flipped open the folder, adjusted his glasses once more, cleared his throat, and began to read. "To Eleanor Crawford." The reaction was immediate. Heads turned in unison, a synchronized movement that might have been comical in any other context. Every pair of eyes, including my daughter's, locked on me with expressions ranging from shock to suspicion to undisguised curiosity. I felt the heat rise to my face, but kept my expression neutral. Years of practice making it possible to maintain composure even as my heart hammered against my ribs. No one spoke. No one blinked. And in that frozen moment, with James Wilson's voice continuing to fill the silence with words I couldn't yet process, I realized the real story was only just beginning. "Hi!" Before Betrayal rewrote my name into whispers, I was simply Eleanor Ellie to those who knew me well. A wife, a mother, an artist who had gradually set aside her brushes for laundry baskets and grocery lists. A woman who believed in building a life rather than chasing one, who found purpose in the quiet spaces between ambition and recognition, Richard and I were married for 25 years. For most of those, I thought we had something steady, something sacred, a partnership built on complementary strengths and shared dreams. We met in our late 20s at a charity auction, where my modest watercolor landscape had been donated by the community college, where I taught part-time Richard outbid everyone, paying far more than the painting was worth. When he approached me afterward, I expected pretension from this man in his tailored suit with his confident smile. Instead, I found genuine enthusiasm for art he admittedly knew little about, but wanted to understand. I don't know much about composition or technique. He had admitted his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. But this painting made me feel something like homesickness for a place I've never been. Is that strange? It wasn't strange. It was exactly what I had hoped to evoke, and his articulation of that feeling, so unpretentious, so direct, disarmed me completely. I was an art instructor with perpetually paint-stained fingers and grand ideas that rarely fit my modest budget. He was a freshly promoted investment broker with an analytical mind and ambitious 5-year plans. His world was spreadsheets and client portfolios. Mine was color theory and negative space. We balanced each other, or so I believed. He gave structure to my artistic chaos. I reminded him that life existed beyond quarterly projections. We married in a modest ceremony on a crisp autumn afternoon in Millfield. The church was small. The cake was from the local bakery, rather than a high-end patisserie. But we laughed like children, discovering a shared secret as we fed each other that first symbolic bite. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment above an independent bookstore downtown, and I set up my easel near the window with the northern light, while Richard converted the dining nook into a home office, where he built his financial consulting business, client by client. Those early years were lean but luminous. We lived on careful budgeting and boundless optimism, always promising each other that one day things would be easier. One day we wouldn't have to check the bank balance before buying new shoes or going out to dinner. We had mismatched furniture collected from yard sales and family hand-me-downs. I sewed curtains from fabric remnants, and Richard spent weekends repairing leaky faucets to avoid calling plumbers we couldn't afford. And gradually things did get easier. Richard's client list grew. His reputation for sound conservative investment advice spread through the business community. He hired an assistant, then an associate, then moved to a proper office downtown with his name etched on a door. He began wearing suits that cost more than our first month's rent, driving to client meetings in a car with leather seats that still smelled new after a year. I stayed home after Abby was born, putting my teaching position on indefinite hold. It was a joint decision, one we discussed at length. Richard's income had finally reached a point where we could survive on it alone, and childcare costs would have eaten most of what I brought in from teaching anyway. Besides, I told myself I could still paint at home, could still nurture that part of myself while raising our daughter. Sophie arrived 3 years later, another perfect blend of Richard's determination and my sensitivity. Our apartment had grown too small for a family of 4, so we purchased a Victorian-style home on Maple Street. Nothing ostentatious but solid and spacious, with a garden in the back where I planted hydrangeas. Because I loved their wild, abundant blooms, I threw myself into motherhood and homemaking with the same creative energy I had once reserved for art. I painted the girls' bedroom with a mural of an enchanted forest. I taught them to bake bread from scratch, to identify birds by their calls, to apologize sincerely when they hurt someone's feelings. I volunteered at their school chaperoned field trips, hosted sleepovers where I built blanket forts in the living room, and served hot chocolate with homemade marshmallows. When Richard came home late, I made sure dinner waited warm in the oven. When he traveled for business conferences, I tucked handwritten notes into his suitcase, little reminders of home, of us, of the life we were building together. He didn't always mention finding them, but occasionally he'd call from his hotel room just to say, "I found your note in my toiletry bag. I miss you too." Looking back now with the clarity that only distance and time can provide, I can see the imbalance that quietly took root beneath our seemingly perfect life. Richard became the public face of our family's success, the one people saw at business functions and community events. I was the foundation, the invisible support structure, the one who ensured everything ran smoothly behind the scene. And I didn't mind not then. I was never hungry for recognition or accolades. I believed in partnership rather than competition, in the dignity of creating a nurturing home. I found satisfaction in watching the girls develop their personalities, in maintaining family traditions, in creating spaces where memories could take shape. When neighbors commented on how lucky I was to have such a successful husband, I agreed without hesitation. When friends from my teaching days asked if I missed my real work, I explained that family was my real work now. Our daughters grew from toddlers to teenagers, their childhoods marked by increasingly comfortable circumstances. We upgraded from a modest sedan to 2 luxury vehicles. Family vacations evolved from camping trips to European tours. The girls attended private school, took piano lessons, joined competitive swim teams. On the outside, we were a portrait of suburban success, the ambitious provider, the supportive wife, the high-achieving children. Neighbors admired us, friends sought Richard's financial advice. And I, in my quiet way, was proud of the life we had created together. But somewhere along the way, something essential began to shift beneath the polished surface of our marriage. In retrospect, the changes were gradual, so incremental that I mistook them for natural evolution rather than warning signs. Richard's workdays grew longer. His phone calls home became shorter, more perfunctory. Weekend family outings gave way to client meetings and networking events that couldn't be rescheduled. I filled the widening gaps with rationalization and understanding. I told myself he was just stressed that it was a particularly demanding quarter, that he was working so hard for our benefit. The truth I didn't want to acknowledge was that the man I had married was slowly becoming someone I barely recognized. And worse, someone who no longer seemed to see me at all. There were no dramatic confrontations, no ultimatums issued across the dinner table. Instead, a soft, insidious silence settled between us like dust on untouched shelves. I would ask about his day, and he would respond with vague generalities before turning the conversation to the girls' activities or upcoming social obligations. I would share something about a new recipe I'd tried, or a community project I'd joined, and he would nod distractedly, his attention never fully leaving his phone or laptop. He wasn't cruel or abusive, not in ways that would have made decisions simpler lines clearer. He was simply absent, present in body but elsewhere in mind and spirit. The small, everyday intimacies that had once defined our relationship, morning coffee shared over the newspaper, evening walks around the neighborhood, lazy Sunday afternoons, reading in companionable silence, gradually disappeared, replaced by parallel lives that occasionally intersected but rarely connected. Even then, I didn't think we were broken beyond repair. I believed we were experiencing what all long-term marriages eventually face: a fallow period, a temporary disconnect that could be bridged with patience and goodwill. I told myself that love was sometimes quiet, that passion naturally ebbed and flowed, that comfort and familiarity were their own form of intimacy. I held on to these beliefs like lifelines, convincing myself that we had simply entered a new phase, that this distance was normal after so many years together. I didn't know then that while I was tending to our home and our children, carefully preserving what I thought was a temporary lull in our connection, Richard was already halfway out the door emotionally, and soon enough physically. I didn't realize that the silence between us wasn't a phase to weather, but a prelude to abandonment. I thought we were safe. I thought we had made it through the difficult years, the lean years, the years of sacrifice and compromise. I had no idea that the real betrayal was still to come, or that it would arrive not with a bang, but with a whisper. The first undeniable sign that something was wrong didn't come in the form of lipstick on a collar or mysterious phone calls taken in hushed tones behind closed doors. It arrived wrapped in elegant linen and fine wine on an evening meant to celebrate Richard's latest professional achievement, the Regional Business Leader Award presented by the Chamber of Commerce. We had been invited to a formal gala downtown, the kind with string quartets past hors d'oeuvres on silver trays and ice sculptures carved to resemble corporate logos. Richard had been nominated for his innovative approach to client-centered financial planning and outstanding contribution to community development. Phrases that would be engraved on the crystal trophy, displayed prominently on our mantle for years afterward. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing for the event, wanting to look my best. Not just for the occasion, but for Richard. After 20 years of marriage, I still wanted him to look at me with appreciation. Still wanted to be the woman he was proud to introduce as his wife. I chose a midnight blue gown he had once complimented, paired with the pearl and diamond earrings he had given me for our 20th anniversary. I styled my hair the way he preferred, loose waves falling just below my shoulders, not too elaborate, but polished enough for a formal setting. When Richard emerged from his closet in his tuxedo, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced precision, he barely glanced in my direction. "We should leave in 5 minutes," he said, checking his watch. "I need to be there early to meet with the event coordinator about my acceptance speech." "You look handsome," I offered, hoping for a reciprocal compliment that didn't come. "Thanks," he replied distractedly, patting his pockets to ensure he had his keys and wallet. "Did you remember to confirm the sitter knows Sophie has that biology project due Monday? She needs to finish the conclusion paragraph." "Yes." I left detailed notes on the kitchen counter. I assured him, swallowing my disappointment and reaching for my wrap. And I told her Sophie needs to be in bed by 10, since she has swim practice tomorrow morning. He nodded, satisfied that the domestic details were handled, and we left in separate cars. He needed to arrive early, and I would probably want to leave before the event concluded, he explained. It was a practical arrangement. He insisted, though it meant I would walk into the gala alone. The venue was a restored historic hotel downtown, its grand ballroom transformed for the evening, with dramatic lighting and elaborate floral displays. I handed my wrap to the coat check attendant and made my way through the growing crowd, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server while scanning the room for familiar faces. Richard was already deep in conversation with a group of men in nearly identical tuxedos, his back partially to the entrance. I hesitated, uncertain whether to approach immediately or give him space for the business networking that was so important to him. Before I could decide a woman I recognized from previous events, Barbara Thompson, the wife of Richard's golf partner, touched my arm lightly. "Eleanor, that dress is stunning on you," she said warmly. "I love seeing someone brave enough to wear something besides black to these functions. Thank you." I smiled, genuinely appreciative of both the compliment and the friendly face. "How have you been? How's Mark's new project going?" We fell into easy conversation about her husband's real estate development, their son's college applications, the renovation of their kitchen. It was pleasant, superficial chatter that required minimal emotional investment, the social currency of these business gatherings. Throughout our exchange, I remained peripherally aware of Richard's location in the room, waiting for him to seek me out to bring me into his circle, as he once would have. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Richard approached, by which time Barbara had drifted away, and I had positioned myself near a high-top table with a fresh glass of wine, watching the room with practiced composure that masked my growing discomfort. "There you are," he said, as if I had been the one difficult to locate in the crowded ballroom. "The seating is about to begin. We're at table 3 near the front." He placed his hand at the small of my back, guiding me toward our assigned table, with the proprietary gesture of a husband, though the touch felt mechanical rather than affectionate. "Is your speech ready?" I asked as we made our way through the crowd. "Do you want me to look it over?" "It's fine," he replied. "Jason from the office helped me polish it yesterday. Very straightforward, nothing complicated." The dismissal stung more than it should have. In the early years of our marriage, Richard had always asked me to review his presentations and speeches, valuing my eye for narrative flow and emotional resonance. Now, apparently, a junior associate's input was preferred to mine. At our table sat 3 other couples, all business associates of Richard's with their spouses, and Victoria Campbell, the newly appointed marketing director at Richard's firm. I had met her briefly at the company Christmas party 6 months earlier, but tonight, she wore a striking red dress that commanded attention. Her blonde hair arranged in an elegant updo that emphasized her delicate neck and shoulders. "Eleanor, you remember Victoria," Richard said as we took our seats. "She's revolutionized our approach to client acquisition these past few months." "Of course," I smiled, extending my hand. "Lovely to see you again, Victoria. The pleasure's mine," she replied, her voice warm, but her eyes evaluating me with subtle assessment. "Richard speaks so highly of you." Before I could respond, the evening's host approached the microphone to begin the program. Throughout dinner, an elaborate 4-course meal, I barely tasted Richard engaged primarily with Victoria and the business associates at our table. The conversation revolving around market trends and client management strategies. I participated when addressed directly, but otherwise focused on making polite conversation with the other spouses who seemed equally accustomed to these dynamics. When it came time for the awards presentation, Richard squeezed my hand briefly before approaching the stage to accept his crystal trophy and deliver his prepared remarks. I watched with genuine pride as he spoke confidently about innovation and community partnership. His charisma undeniable as he balanced professional authority with just enough self-deprecating humor to seem approachable. He thanked his team, his mentors, several clients who had trusted him from the beginning of his career. He acknowledged the Chamber of Commerce and the selection committee. He even thanked his parents. Though his father had been dead for nearly a decade, he never once mentioned me, never glanced in my direction, never included me in the story of his success. I told myself it wasn't personal, that he simply wanted to maintain professional boundaries, that perhaps he thought acknowledging his wife in a business setting would seem nepotistic or inappropriate. But as the applause faded and he returned to our table, trophy in hand, the hollow feeling in my chest expanded. The true moment of clarity, the one I would later recognize as the first undeniable crack in the foundation of our marriage, came later in the evening during the mingling that followed the formal program. Richard was engaged in conversation with several executives from other firms, standing near the bar where I had gone to request a glass of water. As I approached, I heard him introduce Victoria to a distinguished-looking man I didn't recognize. "This is Victoria Campbell, our marketing director. She's the real brains behind our recent expansion." Richard said, his hand resting casually on her upper arm, in a gesture that seemed both proprietary and intimate. The executive turned to me next, his expression politely questioning. Richard's hand fell away from Victoria as he gestured vaguely in my direction. "And this is Eleanor," he said with a casual chuckle. "She keeps me sane at home. Not my wife of 20 years, not my partner, not the mother of my children, or the woman who had supported me from the beginning. Just someone who keeps me sane, like a therapist or a housekeeper or perhaps a pet." The executive nodded politely, already losing interest as his attention returned to Victoria and her insights on digital marketing strategies. The conversation continued around me as I stood there, my water glass cool against my suddenly warm palm, feeling simultaneously exposed and invisible. It was such a small thing, a thoughtless introduction at a business function where alcohol flowed freely and professional identities took precedence over personal ones. But in that moment, something crystallized for me. I understood with sudden, painful clarity that in Richard's narrative of his life, I had been reduced to a supporting character, a vague presence who maintained order in the domestic sphere, while he built empires in the public one. For the remainder of the evening, I performed the role expected of me, smiling at appropriate intervals, making pleasant conversation when engaged, standing by Richard's side when photographs were taken. I was the perfect corporate wife, the uncomplicated accessory to his professional triumph. No one looking at me would have guessed at the tectonic shift occurring beneath my carefully maintained exterior. On the drive home, separate cars, as Richard had arranged, I rehearsed what I might say, how I might open a conversation about what had happened. Not to accuse or demand, but simply to understand, to reconnect to, remind both of us that we had once been partners in the truest sense of the word. When we arrived home, I paid the babysitter while Richard carried his trophy to the study, placing it prominently on the shelf beside his other professional accolades. Sophie had fallen asleep hours earlier, and Abby was at a friend's house for the weekend. The house was quiet, the perfect setting for an honest conversation. "Richard," I began carefully as he loosened his bow tie, "did you mean what you said tonight about me just keeping you sane?" He didn't look up, focused instead on removing his cufflinks and placing them in the small dish on his dresser. "What? Oh, that it was just a casual introduction. Eleanor, don't be so sensitive." Sensitive. That word had begun to follow me like a shadow in recent years, employed whenever I expressed hurt or disappointment, or simply asked for clarification. It was Richard's shield, his way of deflecting accountability by locating the problem in my perception rather than his actions. And every time he used it, I felt myself shrinking a little more, doubting my own emotional responses, questioning whether my needs were indeed unreasonable. "I'm not being sensitive," I said, working to keep my voice steady. I just thought it was strange that after 20 years together, that's how you chose to identify me to your colleagues." He sighed, the sound heavy with impatience. "It was a business function, not a family reunion. No one cares about our personal relationship. Can we not do this tonight? I'm tired and I have an early meeting tomorrow." The dismissal was so complete, so final, that I found myself without a response. I retreated to the bathroom, removing my earrings and carefully hanging the blue dress that had failed to capture my husband's attention. As I studied my reflection in the mirror, the subtle lines around my eyes, the slight softening of my jawline that came with middle age, I wondered when exactly I had become invisible to the man who had once seen me more clearly than anyone else. The days following the gala were quiet, but charged with unspoken tension. Richard returned to his normal routine: early departures, late returns, weekend hours at the office that stretched longer each month. I resumed my own schedule of household management, volunteer commitments, and occasional lunches with friends I had maintained, despite Richard's decreasing interest in our social connections. But something had shifted irreversibly. I had glimpsed a truth I could no longer unsee, and that awareness colored every interaction, every silence, every perfunctory kiss. Goodbye. I began to notice things I had previously overlooked or rationalized: how Richard's cologne had subtly changed, how he had begun taking greater care with his appearance, purchasing new suits and upgrading his watch collection, how his phone never left his side and was now always positioned screen down when not in use, how he laughed more freely during work calls than he did at our dinner table. Still, I didn't confront him directly. I didn't search his phone or follow him to verify his whereabouts. I didn't want to be the suspicious, paranoid wife who monitored her husband's movements. I told myself that marriages went through phases, that this distance between us was temporary, that we had invested too many years to give up without trying to reconnect. But that night at the gala had fundamentally altered my perception. That small moment, that offhand introduction, had revealed something essential about how Richard now viewed me, and perhaps had viewed me, for longer than I wanted to admit. I was no longer at the center of his world. I had become peripheral, functional, a component of his life rather than a partner in it. And though I didn't yet know the full extent of his betrayal, some part of me had already begun to prepare for what would come next. After the gala night, it was as if something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of our home. Not visibly, not violently, but incrementally, like a house settling improperly on its foundation, creating hairline cracks that would eventually compromise the entire structure. From the outside, our life appeared unchanged. We still shared meals when Richard was home, still attended Abby and Sophie's school events together, still maintained the routines and rhythms that defined our household. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, something essential had gone silent between us. Conversations became increasingly transactional, focused on logistics rather than connection. Sophie has a dentist appointment Tuesday. The furnace needs servicing before winter. Don't forget Abby's college application deadline is next week. We functioned like efficient business partners, managing a joint enterprise rather than life partners, sharing intimacy and vulnerability. Richard's absences grew more frequent and less explained. He began coming home progressively later, sometimes texting to say he was working on quarterly reports or meeting with clients who could only see him after hours. Some nights he didn't come home at all, claiming business dinners in the city had run too late to drive back safely, or that unexpected client emergencies required his early presence at the office the next morning. I stopped asking for details, partly because I dreaded confrontation, but mostly because his explanations had taken on a rehearsed quality that made me doubt their authenticity. "It's work, Eleanor," he would say, with barely concealed impatience when I expressed concern about his schedule. "You know how it is this time of year." But I didn't know. Not anymore. I used to understand his work intimately. The cycles of client acquisition and portfolio reviews, the pressure of market fluctuations, the delicate balance of risk management. In the early years, I had helped him practice presentations, proofread, client communications, even organized social events to help him network with potential investors. Now I was no longer included in that world. I wasn't invited to firm functions, unless protocol demanded a spouse's presence. I wasn't consulted on business decisions that would affect our family schedule. I had been compartmentalized, separated from the professional identity that increasingly defined him. Our 25th wedding anniversary fell on a Tuesday in April. I had marked the date months in advance, hoping we might use the milestone as an opportunity to reconnect, to remember what had drawn us together, and sustain us through a quarter century of shared life. I didn't expect grand gestures or lavish gifts, just acknowledgement presents, perhaps a quiet dinner, where we might look at each other without distraction. I prepared his favorite meal lemon herb chicken, with roasted carrots and garlic mashed potatoes. I set the dining room table with our wedding china pieces, rarely used but preserved for special occasions. I opened a bottle of the Bordeaux we had discovered on our 20th anniversary trip to France, allowing it to breathe, while candles flickered softly against the approaching evening. I wore a simple dress in a shade of green, he had once said, brought out the gold flecks in my eyes, and I arranged my hair the way I had worn it on our wedding day. A detail he was unlikely to notice, but that felt significant to me. 6 o'clock came and went. Then 7, I sent a text at 7:30. "Dinner's ready, whenever you are." No response. At 8, I called his office and got the after-hours voicemail. I called his cell phone and was sent directly to voicemail. I left no message, uncertain what I could say that wouldn't sound accusatory or desperate. By 9, the food had gone cold. I wrapped it carefully and placed it in the refrigerator. By 10, the candles had burned low, wax pooling on the polished wood of the table. I had so carefully set, I blew them out one by one, watching the small flames extinguish in tiny wisps of smoke. By 11, I had changed out of the green dress, removed the minimal makeup I had applied, and was sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at our wedding photograph. On the dresser, younger versions of ourselves, smiling with unguarded hope, unaware of what lay ahead. Richard walked in at 6:45 the next morning, wearing the same clothes he had left in the day before. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, stubble darkening his jaw. He smelled of unfamiliar cologne and stale coffee. "Sorry about last night," he said, dropping his briefcase by the door, as I stood at the kitchen counter mechanically preparing his morning coffee, out of habit rather than intention. "Didn't you get my message? Last-minute dinner with the Thomason group ran long, and then we moved to the hotel bar for negotiations. By the time we wrapped up, it made more sense to crash at the Marriott downtown than drive all the way back. I thought I texted you." There had been no message, no text, no call, no acknowledgement of the date's significance. I poured his coffee into the travel mug. He preferred no sugar, a splash of cream, and slid it across the counter without meeting his eyes. It was our anniversary, I said quietly, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact. He paused, mug halfway to his lips, A flicker of something recognition, regret, calculation, crossing his features before his expression settled into practiced contrition. Shit, Ellie. I completely forgot. With the Thompson acquisition and the quarterly reports due, I'm sorry I'll make it up to you. We'll do something special this weekend. The casual use of my nickname, Ellie not Eleanor, was a calculated intimacy employed when he needed to soften a disappointment or deflect potential conflict. He hadn't called me Ellie in ordinary conversation for years. It's fine. I said the lie bitter on my tongue. The girls called at least. He nodded, clearly relieved to be excused so easily, and gulped his coffee before heading upstairs to shower and change. We didn't speak of the anniversary again. The promised weekend celebration never materialized, lost in the shuffle of Sophie's swim meet and Richard's sudden need to visit a client in Boston. That morning marked a subtle but crucial shift in our relationship. It wasn't that Richard had forgotten our anniversary. People forget dates, even important ones. It wasn't even the obvious lie about texting me. It was the realization that had settled over me. As I watched him retreat up the stairs, I no longer believed him. Not about where he had been. Not about the client dinner. Not about forgetting our anniversary. After 25 years of trusting him implicitly, of giving him the benefit of every doubt, of making excuses to myself and others, for his absences and oversights, I had finally reached the threshold where faith tipped into skepticism. This internal shift didn't manifest as confrontation or ultimatums. Instead, it emerged as a quiet withdrawal of the emotional labor. I had always invested in our relationship. I stopped waiting by the window when he worked late. I stopped preparing elaborate meals only to have them go uneaten. I stopped asking about his day or sharing details of mine. I stopped reaching for him in the darkness of our bedroom, no longer willing to risk rejection under the guise of exhaustion or early meetings. Instead, I began to notice things with almost forensic detachment, cataloging changes and inconsistencies without immediately trying to explain them away. His new preference for shirts and colors I had never purchased for him. The unfamiliar scent that sometimes clung to his jackets. The subtle shift in his vocabulary, incorporating phrases and references that weren't part of our shared lexicon. The increasing frequency with which Victoria's name appeared in his anecdotes about work, followed by careful neutrality when he noticed my attention sharpen. Still, I didn't confront him directly, partly because concrete evidence remained elusive, but mostly because I found myself in the disorienting position of simultaneously knowing and not wanting to know. Confirmation would demand action, would require decisions I wasn't yet prepared to make. So I existed in a liminal space of partial awareness, watching my marriage dissolve in slow motion while going through the motions of normalcy. The girls, now in their late teens, had built busy lives that increasingly took them away from home. Abby was in her senior year focused on college applications and maintaining her position as editor of the school newspaper. Sophie was immersed in competitive swimming and advanced placement classes. Her quiet determination reminiscent of her father's focused ambition. They noticed the growing distance between Richard and me. How could they not but interpreted it through the lens of their own relationships with each of us? Abby, always closer to Richard, often sided with him in subtle ways. When I expressed disappointment about missed family dinners, she would shrug and say, "Dad's busy, Mom. His job is important." When I suggested weekend activities without checking Richard's availability first, she would sigh with teenage exasperation. You know he has client calls on Saturdays. Why do you always plan things when he can't come? Sophie, more sensitive to undercurrents of emotion, would sometimes find me in the kitchen late at night, sitting alone with a cup of tea, and ask quietly, "Are you okay, Mom?" But even when I assured her everything was fine, I could see the doubt in her eyes, the awareness that something essential was fraying in our family fabric. Though she couldn't quite identify the loose thread, I tried to maintain normalcy for their sake, to ensure that the growing void between Richard and me didn't swallow the stability. They had always known I attended their events, helped with homework, maintained holiday traditions, and kept the household running with the same attention to detail that had always characterized my approach to family life. But increasingly, I felt like an actor in a play where my co-star had quietly exited stage left, leaving me to carry scenes designed for two. The final breaking point came not with dramatic discovery or explosive confrontation, but with a small public humiliation that crystallized everything I had been trying not to see. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in early June, the kind of day that should have felt sacred in its ordinary beauty, warm sunshine filtering through just enough cloud cover to prevent discomfort, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass, and blooming hydrangeas from our garden. We were hosting a small gathering to celebrate Abby's acceptance to Princeton, her first choice school, and Richard's alma mater. Nothing extravagant, just close friends, a few family members, and a handful of Abby's classmates, all congregating in our backyard around tables set with simple elegance beneath string lights and paper lanterns. I had spent the entire week planning a menu that balanced sophistication with approachability, selecting floral arrangements that complemented the garden without competing with it, ensuring the house gleamed with the kind of effortless perfection that actually required days of meticulous attention. Not because I particularly enjoyed entertaining, but because I wanted Abby to feel celebrated, to have tangible evidence of our pride in her accomplishment. Richard hadn't offered to help with the preparations, but I hadn't asked. By then, our domestic division of labor was so entrenched that requesting assistance would have required more emotional energy than simply handling everything myself. He showed up that morning in khakis and a crisp navy button-down, freshly shaved and cologne-scented, playing the role of proud father with practiced ease. He greeted arriving guests with firm handshakes and warm claps on shoulders, pouring drinks and making introductions as if we were co-hosts, rather than increasingly distant housemates. I moved between kitchen and garden, carrying out platters of grilled vegetables and chilled seafood, refreshing empty serving dishes, ensuring everyone had what they needed. I laughed when appropriate answered questions about Abby's plans with maternal pride, and carefully steered conversations away from any topics that might expose the growing fissures in our family structure. Victoria arrived midway through the afternoon, not as Richard's guest, but ostensibly as a +1, accompanying his colleague Michael. Though I noted the practiced casualness with which they maintained physical distance from each other in our presence. She wore a sundress in a shade of coral that flattered her complexion, her blonde hair falling in perfectly tousled waves that suggested both effort and nonchalance. She handed Abby a small gift bag containing a Princeton alumni sweatshirt, explaining that Richard had mentioned his daughter's acceptance, and she thought it would be a nice gesture. "Dad says you're the one who streamlined their whole client acquisition process," Abby said, clearly impressed. "That must have been a massive undertaking." Victoria smiled modestly, though pleasure at the recognition shone in her eyes. "Your father gives me too much credit," He had already built an incredible foundation. I just helped modernize some of the approaches. I watched this exchange from a few feet away, noting the easy rapport between them, the way Abby looked at Victoria, with undisguised admiration, the same expression she had once reserved for me when I taught her to ride a bike, or helped her navigate middle school social politics. Something cold and heavy settled in my stomach, a recognition that Victoria wasn't just a potential romantic rival, but a complete replacement. Younger, more professionally accomplished, untethered from the messy reality of child-rearing and household management that had been my domain for 2 decades. As the afternoon progressed, I maintained my composure with practiced grace, refilling glasses and facilitating conversations with the skill of someone who had spent years making others comfortable, even at personal cost. Richard moved through the gathering with similar expertise, though I noticed he seemed most animated when speaking with Victoria or when discussing Abby's future at his beloved alma mater. The careful distance between them couldn't quite mask the current of awareness that connected them across the crowded garden. Toward the end of the afternoon, someone, I believe it was Richard's brother James, tapped a glass with a fork to propose a toast. The chatter quieted as guests turned their attention to where James stood near the center of the patio, champagne flute raised. To Abby, he began with genuine affection, who clearly inherited her father's brains and her mother's determination. Princeton won't know what hit them. Laughter rippled through the gathering as Abby blushed pleased at the acknowledgement. James continued. And of course, to Rich and Eleanor, who've raised an exceptional young woman. 25 years of marriage and still setting the bar for the rest of us. Everyone raised their glasses. I smiled reflexively. Years of social conditioning, allowing me to maintain the appropriate expression, despite the hollow ache spreading beneath my ribs. Richard stepped closer to me, close enough that our arms almost touched, but without actually making contact, a public performance of unity that felt like the cruelest pretense. Well, Richard said, raising his own glass with a charming smile that had once made my heart flutter, but now seemed like a stranger's expression. If Abby turns out half as brilliant as her mother, and hopefully twice as practical, I'll consider my parental duties fulfilled. There was polite laughter, not uproarious, but enough to create a ripple of sound through the garden. My smile remained fixed, though I felt it threatening to crack at the edges. Practical. Such a benign word on the surface, but in Richard's mouth, it had become coded language. A subtle dig at what he increasingly portrayed as my rigidity. My adherence to schedules and traditions, my supposed inability to adapt to his evolving priorities. I caught Victoria's eye briefly across the gathering. She wasn't laughing, but something in her expression, a subtle blend of sympathy and satisfaction, told me she understood exactly what Richard was communicating. Beneath the seemingly innocuous comment, she knew me only through his descriptions, I realized. And those descriptions must have painted me as the uptight wife, the convenient obstacle to his happiness, the woman too emotionally demanding, yet simultaneously too domestically focused to understand his greater ambitions. In that moment, standing in the garden I had planted and tended for 15 years, surrounded by guests I had welcomed into our home, something crystallized within me, a clarity so profound it felt almost like physical pain. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly sad. I was simply done pretending, done making excuses, done carrying the emotional weight of a relationship that existed now only in public performance and shared household expenses. I excused myself from the gathering, with a murmured comment about checking the dessert trays, walking back into the house, with unhurried steps that belied the seismic shift occurring within me. In the quiet of our kitchen, surrounded by evidence of the life I had built and maintained the copper pots hanging above the island, the children's artwork magnetized to the refrigerator, the calendar tracking family obligations. In my careful handwriting, I placed both palms flat on the cool granite countertop and drew a deep, steadying breath. I didn't cry. I didn't slam cabinet doors or throw dishes. Instead, I methodically arranged coffee cups on a serving tray, placed the platter of petit fours I had spent the previous evening preparing beside them, and returned to the garden to continue playing the role expected of me. But something fundamental had changed, like a key turning in a lock, opening a door I had previously been afraid to approach. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Abby had gone to celebrate further with friends, I found Richard in his study, reviewing client files with a glass of scotch at his elbow. His normal Sunday evening routine, as if the day had been entirely unremarkable. "We need to talk," I said from the doorway, my voice calmer than I had expected it to be. He glanced up, barely making eye contact, before returning his attention to his laptop screen. "Can it wait until tomorrow? I've got the Peterson portfolio review, first thing in the morning, and I need to finish these projections." "No," I replied simply. "It can't wait." Something in my tone must have registered because he looked up again, his expression shifting from distraction to wariness. "What is it? I want to know why you said that today in front of everyone." "Said what?" he asked, though the slight tension around his mouth suggested he knew exactly what I was referring to. That comment about me being practical. "The way you said it, like it was something to be overcome rather than appreciated." He sighed, setting down his pen with exaggerated patience. "It was a joke, Eleanor. A compliment, even. You're overthinking this as usual." "As usual," I repeated, noting how quickly he had shifted to positioning me as the problem. "That's interesting because you've made similar jokes at the last 3 events we've attended together. Always with the same underlying message that I'm somehow rigid or difficult or limiting in some way." Richard leaned back in his chair, his posture defensive, despite his attempt at casual dismissal. "You're being oversensitive. It was a toast to our daughter, not an attack on you." There it was again. Oversensitive. The familiar accusation designed to make me doubt my own perceptions, to question whether my hurt was legitimate or simply evidence of my emotional excess. But this time, the word didn't land with its usual impact. Instead, it crystallized my newfound clarity. "I'm not being oversensitive," I said quietly. "I'm finally seeing things clearly. You've been pulling away for years, Richard. Not just physically, but emotionally. And rather than simply tell me the truth that you don't want this marriage anymore, you've been gradually recasting me as the villain in your narrative. The demanding wife. The practical one who doesn't understand your greater vision. The emotional burden you have to manage. His expression hardened defensiveness, giving way to cold irritation. "That's ridiculous. I've been building a business, Eleanor, something that supports this family, that pays for this house, and Abby's Ivy League tuition, and Sophie's swim team, and 1,000 other expenses. If I've been distant, it's because I've been carrying the financial responsibility for all of us. I never asked for any of that," I replied, maintaining my composure despite the anger building beneath my sternum. "I would have been happy with less, with enough, with a husband who actually saw me instead of looking through me while planning his exit strategy." "Exit strategy?" He laughed, though the sound contained no humor. "Now you're being paranoid on top of everything else." I studied him, this man I had loved for more than half my life. This stranger whose defenses I could now see through, with painful clarity. "Are you having an affair with Victoria?" The question hung between us, direct and unavoidable. Richard's expression shifted minutely. Surprise followed by calculation, then careful neutrality. "That's beneath you, Eleanor. Not a denial. Not even a convincing deflection. Just another attempt to position me as unreasonable for asking the obvious question. You know what's beneath me." I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke me. Continuing to pretend I don't see what's happening. Accepting public humiliation as the price of keeping this marriage intact. Modeling for our daughters that a woman's value depends on her willingness to be invisible when convenient. Richard stood abruptly, his chair rolling back against the bookcase behind his desk. "I'm not having this conversation right now. You're clearly upset and not thinking rationally. We can discuss this tomorrow when you've calmed down." In that moment, I saw our entire future with sudden, devastating clarity. Years of continued dismissal of gaslighting, disguised as concern of my perceptions being invalidated, while my worth was systematically diminished. And I made a decision that surprised even me with its immediacy and certainty. "No," I said simply, "we won't be discussing this tomorrow. I'm done, Richard." Not because of Victoria, not even because of whatever lies you've told. I'm done because I deserve better than to be treated like an inconvenient obligation in my own life. He stared at me, genuinely startled by the finality in my voice. For years I had been the peacemaker, the one who accommodated and adjusted and found ways to smooth over conflicts. This unwavering boundary was unfamiliar territory. "You're being dramatic," he said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "This is exactly the kind of emotional overreaction I've been talking about. Call it whatever you need to," I replied, turning to leave. "It doesn't change my decision." That night I slept in the guest room. Not dramatically, not with tearful declarations or slammed doors, but with quiet determination I told Richard I needed space, and he didn't argue. Perhaps relieved to avoid further confrontation, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling, where shadows played across the textured paint, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Not happiness, certainly not peace, but this strange serenity that comes with finally acknowledging a truth long denied. My marriage wasn't ending in that moment. In reality, it had been ending for years, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, absence by absence. I had simply finally stopped pretending otherwise. The end of our marriage, the official legal dissolution of 25 years together, arrived without cinematic drama or cathartic confrontation. There was no single defining moment when everything shattered beyond repair. No explosive revelation that made decisions simple and paths clear. Instead, there was a quiet accumulation of small abandonments that eventually made staying more painful than leaving. The day Richard asked me to move out, or rather, suggested it as he framed it, was ordinary in every other respect. The summer had given way to early autumn leaves just beginning to turn at their edges, the air carrying the first hint of approaching coolness. After months of humidity, I was folding laundry in our bedroom, organized piles of cotton and linen arranged on the duvet cover. The mindless task allowing me to mentally plan the week ahead while humming softly to myself. Richard appeared in the doorway, freshly showered after his Sunday golf game. hair still damp at his temples. He watched me for a moment before speaking, his expression carefully neutral. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone measured, "that it might be better for both of us if we had some space." My hand stilled over the shirt I was folding. One of his, ironically, a blue Oxford I had ironed countless times over the years. I didn't immediately respond, taking a moment to absorb what he was actually proposing. Not separation in the theoretical sense we had been inhabiting since our confrontation months earlier, but physical, logistical separation. Not him leaving the home we had built together, but me. My heart didn't break in that moment. Not because the suggestion wasn't painful, but because something in me had been preparing for this inevitability, like internal scaffolding, constructed beneath the surface of my conscious awareness, bracing for impact. "Pass." I repeated the word, falling flat between us. "You want me to move out?" He shifted his weight, leaning against the door frame, in a pose of casual discomfort. "It doesn't have to be dramatic, Eleanor. We're clearly in different places right now. We haven't been connecting for a while. We've been living separate lives for months anyway." Separate lives. The euphemism was almost laughable in its inadequacy. He didn't say he was in love with someone else, though we both knew Victoria had become more than a colleague. He didn't mention the late nights, the weekend, conferences, the gradually increasing boldness with which he had pursued his new life, while still technically inhabiting our marriage. He offered no real explanation, no accountability, no acknowledgement of what he was dismantling, just detachment wrapped in practical language. I set down the shirt, smoothing it with an automatic gesture before meeting his gaze. "And the girls, have you discussed this with them? Abby's already at college," he said, as if her physical absence somehow diminished her stake in her parents' separation. "Sophie's finishing her senior year. It's not like they're small children who need constant supervision anymore." The dismissiveness of his response clarified something I had been struggling to articulate even to myself. Richard wasn't just leaving our marriage. He was retroactively diminishing its value, recasting our family life as something incidental rather than central to his identity. The years I had devoted to creating a home, to raising our daughters, to supporting his ambitions, all of it reframed as a chapter he had completed rather than a foundation we had built together. I nodded slowly, not in agreement but in recognition of what was happening, what had already happened long before this conversation. "Okay," I said simply, the single word hung between us. Not, "How could you?" or "Don't do this," or "Let's try counseling." Just acceptance of a reality I could no longer pretend didn't exist. The lack of protest seemed to surprise him. Perhaps he had prepared counter-arguments for emotional appeals that never came. "Okay," he repeated, eyebrows drawing together slightly. "That's it? What did you expect, Richard Tears begging? I've spent years trying to hold on to someone who was already gone. I'm tired. I'm not going to fight for space in a life where I've already been erased." He looked momentarily disconcerted, perhaps recognizing that the narrative he had constructed of the emotional, demanding wife he needed freedom from didn't align with the composed woman standing before him, accepting the dissolution of our marriage with dignity rather than desperation. "This is for the best," he said finally, the platitude sounding hollow even to my ears. "We can be civil about this. No need for ugliness or lawyers turning it into a battle." I almost laughed at the transparency of his concern, not for my well-being or the emotional impact on our daughters, but for the potential financial and public relations implications of a contested divorce. Ever the strategist, already calculating the most efficient exit with minimal damage to his reputation and resources. "I'll find a place," I said, returning to the laundry and picking up another shirt to fold. "I'd like a few weeks to make arrangements." He nodded, clearly relieved at my practicality, the very quality he had mocked at Abby's celebration. "Of course, take whatever time you need, and we'll need to discuss logistics, division of assets, that sort of thing. Division of assets." As if our life together could be neatly catalogued and apportioned every memory and sacrifice, assigned a dollar value, and distributed according to some actuarial formula. But I didn't argue. I simply continued folding the familiar routine of creating order from chaos, providing a strange comfort in the face of imminent upheaval. Richard lingered for a moment longer, perhaps waiting for something more, recrimination or nostalgia, or some acknowledgement of the magnitude of what was ending. When none came, he retreated with a murmured comment about emails needing attention, the soft click of his study door down the hall, signaling his withdrawal. Not just from the conversation, but from the weight of its consequences. In the following days, I moved through our home with new awareness, seeing it not as the backdrop to my ongoing life, but as a space I would soon leave behind. I began mental inventories which items were sentimentally irreplaceable, which were merely convenient, which belonged more to Richard's taste than mine. I researched rental properties in neighboring communities, wanting to remain close enough to maintain connectivity with Sophie during her final year of high school, but far enough to establish genuine separation. When I told the girls about our decision, presenting it as mutual, rather than unilateral, shielding them from details that would only burden them with unnecessary loyalty conflicts, their reactions diverged along the fault lines already established in our family dynamic. Abby, speaking via video call from her dormitory at Princeton, seemed unsurprised and primarily concerned with practical implications. "Are you selling the house? Where will I stay during breaks? Does this mean separate holidays now?" Her questions focused on logistics rather than emotions her father's daughter to the core. Sophie, however, absorbed the news with quiet devastation that manifested not in tears or protests, but in a physical withdrawal, her slender shoulders curving inward as if to protect her heart from further injury. "I thought things were getting better," she said softly, though her tone suggested she had been trying to convince herself of this rather than genuinely believing it. "Sometimes relationships reach their natural conclusion," I explained, choosing my words carefully to avoid assigning blame or demanding they take sides. "Your father and I have different priorities now, different visions for the future. But that doesn't change how much we both love you and Abby. That will never change." Sophia nodded, though the gesture contained more resignation than acceptance. "Does this have something to do with Victoria?" she asked directly, her perceptiveness catching me off guard. I hesitated, balancing honesty against the need to protect her from unnecessary pain. "What makes you ask that, Mom?" "I'm not blind," she said with a maturity that both impressed and saddened me. "I've seen how Dad looks at her, how they lean toward each other when they think no one's watching." I just didn't want to believe it. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "The reasons marriages end are usually complicated, sweetheart. Rarely just one factor or one person. Your father and I have been growing in different directions for a long time." It wasn't a direct confirmation, but it acknowledged her perception without forcing her to shoulder the burden of her father's choices. Some truths were too heavy for children to carry, even adult children who thought themselves ready for the full weight of parental reality. Within 3 weeks, I had signed a lease on a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Riverdale, about 20 minutes from our family home. It was nothing like the spacious, carefully curated house where I had raised my daughters. Smaller, plainer, with outdated kitchen appliances and worn carpet in the hallway. But it offered northern light for painting a small balcony, with space for potted herbs, and most importantly, the promise of autonomy, a space defined by my choices alone. I took relatively little from the home I had maintained for nearly 2 decades, my personal clothing and toiletries, books I had collected over the years, art supplies, and the few paintings I had completed during sporadic returns to creative practice. Family photographs carefully selected to preserve memories without clinging to false narratives. And a few kitchen implements I had grown attached to through years of daily use. I left behind the wedding album, the anniversary gifts Richard had given me in the early years, when such occasions still merited celebration, and the expensive kitchen gadgets that had been household investments rather than personal possessions. The actual day of my departure was anticlimactic. Richard was conveniently absent, a client emergency, requiring his attention downtown, and Sophie was at swim practice. I loaded the last few boxes into my car beneath an overcast sky that threatened rain, but never delivered the physical manifestation of my departure, as muted as the emotional reality had been. As I took a final walk through the empty rooms, trailing my fingers along familiar surfaces, and breathing in the scent of lemon furniture polish and the lingering notes of the cinnamon candles I had always burned in autumn, I waited for the wave of grief that should accompany such a significant ending. It never came, not because I felt nothing, but because the real ending had occurred years earlier, in increments so small, they were almost imperceptible, until the distance was too vast to bridge. What I felt instead was a complex mixture of loss and possibility, mourning not just for the marriage that had failed, but for the years spent trying to revive something already gone, alongside a tentative hope that whatever came next might allow me to rediscover parts of myself that had been gradually diminished by Richard's indifference. I didn't leave a note. There were no final words that could adequately encompass 25 years of shared history or the complicated reality of its dissolution. Instead, I placed my key on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker, a small symbolic surrender of the space I had once believed would frame the entirety of my life. The apartment in Riverdale became my sanctuary, though not immediately or easily. The first weeks were disorienting, filled with the practical challenges of establishing new routines in unfamiliar surroundings, and the emotional labor of explaining my changed circumstances to friends and acquaintances who had known us only as a unit. Some reacted with genuine concern and support. Others responded with thinly veiled judgment, their questions loaded with assumptions. Was there someone else involved? Yes, but not on my side. Did you try counseling? Richard refused. Couldn't you have worked harder to save the marriage? I worked until there was nothing left to save. The nights were hardest initially, the silence more profound, the empty space beside me in bed, a persistent reminder of absence. I developed new rituals to fill the quiet hours, herbal tea instead of wine, audiobooks instead of television, journal writing instead of scrolling social media. I began to reclaim my relationship with solitude, distinguishing between loneliness and the productive solitude necessary for creative renewal. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the apartment began to feel like mine, rather than simply Not ours. I arranged furniture according to my preferences, without compromising for someone else's comfort. I played music Richard had always dismissed as too melodramatic or esoteric. I left my painting supplies out on the small dining table, rather than tucking them away after each use. I ate breakfast for dinner when the mood struck and stayed up reading until 3 a.m. without concern for disturbing anyone else's sleep. These small exercises in autonomy weren't acts of rebellion, but reclamations, gentle reminders that I was a person with valid preferences and desires, not merely an extension of someone else's life or a convenient supporting character in their narrative. They were hesitant at first, these assertions of self, but they grew stronger with practice, like muscles long unused, but gradually remembering their strength. Sophie visited regularly, our relationship deepening in unexpected ways through the upheaval. Without the buffer of Richard's presence, without the constant adjustment to his moods and preferences that had become the second nature, I found myself more fully present with my daughter, more attentive to her thoughts, more responsive to her needs, more authentic in my own expressions of joy and concern. Abby's visits were less frequent and more circumscribed. Her loyalty clearly divided, though she attempted neutrality. I didn't press her for details about her father's new life, didn't ask whether Victoria had officially moved into the house I had left, didn't burden her with the weight of my private grief or anger. I simply met her, where she was accepting the boundaries she established, while maintaining the door remained open whenever she chose to walk through it. Richard and I communicated primarily through lawyers and occasionally text messages regarding logistics tax documents that needed signatures Sophie's college applications, the eventual sale of the family home once she graduated high school. Our interactions were cordial but distant, the practiced politeness of business associates, rather than the intimate shorthand of former spouses. I heard through Sophie that he and Victoria had made their relationship official shortly after our separation, surprising no one within their social circle. I absorbed this confirmation of what I had already known with less pain than I might have expected, not because the betrayal didn't matter, but because naming it officially didn't change what had already been reality for longer than I had been willing to acknowledge. The true work of healing came not in the immediate aftermath of separation, but in the quiet months that followed, when the practical aspects of divorce had been settled and the emotional landscape stretched before me like uncharted territory. It came in small moments of recognition the first time I made a major decision without automatically considering someone else's preferences. The first holiday I celebrated according to my own traditions rather than inherited ones. The first morning I woke feeling anticipation rather than resignation, and it came through unexpected channels, most significantly through a letter I discovered nearly a year after moving out of communication that would reshape my understanding not just of my marriage's end, but of my own path forward. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day where nothing feels particularly significant, where the hours unfold with such ordinary predictability that they seem destined to blend unremarkably into the background of memory. I had taken the afternoon off from the part-time administrative position I'd secured at a local art therapy center, using the unexpected free hours to sort through boxes still unpacked from my move nearly a year earlier. The storage closet in my apartment had become a repository for items I hadn't yet found proper places for, or perhaps more accurately, things I hadn't yet decided whether to keep or discard. Each box represented a decision postponed, a reckoning with the past I hadn't felt equipped to complete during the initial upheaval of separation. The boxes were labeled in my neat handwriting, kitchen odds and ends, winter clothes, photo albums, and one simply marked Daniel. That one stopped me. My hands hovering over the sealed packing tape as something tightened in my chest. Daniel Crawford, my brother, 3 years younger, and infinitely more practical than I had ever been. The only family member who had truly checked in during the disintegration of my marriage, who had offered help without judgment, who had seen through Richard's carefully constructed public persona long before I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. Daniel had died 14 months earlier from a heart attack so sudden and unexpected that I still sometimes reached for my phone to call him before remembering he wouldn't answer. He had been only 52, seemingly healthy, aside from the stress of running his construction business, married with 2 teenage sons, and a mortgage nearly paid off. And then he was gone. Another reminder that life offered no guarantees, no matter how carefully one planned. I pulled the box toward me and opened it carefully, as if its contents might somehow be fragile, despite their inanimate nature. Inside were the few possessions of Daniel's I had chosen to keep, when his wife Claire had invited family members to select mementos after the funeral. His favorite flannel shirt, still smelling faintly of the sandalwood cologne he had worn for 20 years. A dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea that had been our father's before it was his. A small wooden box he had crafted in high school shop class, and several file folders containing documents related to the renovation he had helped me plan for the kitchen in the house I no longer owned. Beneath these items lay a yellow legal envelope slightly bent at the corners, with my name written across the front in Daniel's distinctive handwriting. For Ellie Reed when you're ready. My heart stuttered in my chest. I had no memory of seeing this envelope before, no recollection of placing it in the box with Daniel's other possessions. I held it for a long moment, strangely reluctant to discover its contents, as if opening it might somehow finalize Daniel's absence, in a way even his funeral had not. Finally, I broke the seal and withdrew 2 items, a folded piece of notepaper that appeared to be from Daniel himself, and beneath it, a separate sheet that looked older, creased from apparent multiple foldings and unfoldings. I read Daniel's note first, his handwriting so achingly familiar that for a moment I could almost hear his voice speaking the words. Ellie? I found this while helping sort through some of Richard's old files during the kitchen renovation planning. It was mixed in with insurance documents from the filing cabinet in his study. I wasn't snooping, you know me better than that. But once I realized what it was, I couldn't put it back and pretend I hadn't seen it. I wasn't sure when to give this to you. You looked so broken in those first months after he left, and I didn't want to make things worse. But I also knew this wasn't mine to keep. You deserve the truth, Ellie. All of it. However painful, I love you. I've always believed you were the strongest of us all, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Daniel! My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the second sheet. It was a letter written on Richard's personal stationery, the heavy cream paper embossed with his initials in the upper right corner. The letter was dated nearly 2 years earlier, months before our separation, while we were still maintaining the pretense of a functioning marriage. It wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, bore no greeting or salutation. It appeared to be something written, but never sent. Perhaps a draft abandoned or a confession never delivered. I read slowly each word, registering with painful clarity. If you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to say what I've been unable to speak aloud. I've done things I can't undo, made choices that have hurt people who deserved better. Leaving Eleanor the way I did gradually, withdrawing while making her believe she was somehow at fault, is the one thing I can't justify, even to myself. I didn't leave because I stopped loving her. I left because I couldn't bear the person I had become in our marriage. Cold, distant, critical of the very qualities that once drew me to her. Her steadiness reminded me of everything I was failing to be. Her creative spirit highlighted how conventional and safe my own choices had become. Her emotional honesty made me aware of how much I had closed myself off, not just from her, but from any genuine connection. Victoria didn't steal me or save me. She was simply unfamiliar enough that I could pretend to be someone new. With her, someone unburdened by years of mounting failures and disappointments. Someone who hadn't spent decades gradually betraying his best self and his most important promises. Eleanor gave me a home, 2 extraordinary daughters, and years of unwavering support that I repaid with neglect and eventual abandonment. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I simply needed to acknowledge, even if only on paper, that she was never the problem. She was always the best part of the life I systematically dismantled, because I lacked the courage to face my own emptiness. The letter ended there. No signature, no closing sentiment, just the abrupt termination of a confession that had apparently gone no further than this single sheet of paper hidden among mundane financial records. I read it 3 times each pass, revealing nuances I had missed in the initial shock of discovery. I sat on the floor of my storage closet, the letter resting in my lap, unsure what to feel. There was validation, certainly, confirmation that the gaslighting I had experienced wasn't imagined, that the gradual erosion of my self-worth had been a strategy rather than a consequence. There was anger, too, a fresh wave of it washing through me at the realization that Richard had been conscious of his behavior, aware of its impact, yet had continued it regardless. But beneath these immediate reactions stirred something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but a strange, sad understanding. The letter revealed not just Richard's betrayal, but his cowardice, his inability to face his own dissatisfaction with the life he had chosen. It painted a portrait not of a villain, but of a deeply flawed man running from himself, using others as both escape routes and scapegoats. This insight didn't excuse what he had done. It didn't erase the pain or heal the wounds his abandonment had inflicted, but it shifted something fundamental in my perception, not of Richard, but of myself. For years I had internalized his narrative that I was too emotional, too practical, too something or not enough something else. I had accepted my assigned role as the impediment to his happiness, the boulder tethering him to a life he had outgrown. Now, holding physical evidence that contradicted this entire construction, I felt a strange liberation. Not joy, not vindication, but the quiet relief of setting down a burden I had never been meant to carry. The failure of our marriage hadn't been my failure. The inadequacy I had felt wasn't a reflection of actual deficiency, but the inevitable result of being measured against impossible shifting standards, designed specifically to find me wanting. I carefully folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box on my bedside table. Not because I needed to revisit Richard's confession regularly, but because it marked a boundary, a line between before and after between, believing myself somehow defective and recognizing I had been misjudged. It was evidence not of what I had lost, but of what I had survived. That evening I did something I hadn't done in years. I set up my easel near the window of my apartment, arranged my paints on a small table beside it, and began to work without preliminary sketches or specific intentions. I simply allowed color and form to emerge from the motion of my hand across canvas, trusting the process rather than focusing on the outcome. I painted until well past midnight, losing myself in the meditative rhythm of creation, in the dialogue between hand and eye and heart that had once been as natural to me as breathing before practical concerns and family responsibilities had gradually pushed it to the margins of my life. What emerged wasn't technically perfect or conceptually revolutionary, just a simple study of light falling across ordinary objects, rendering them momentarily extraordinary through attention and perspective. But in that act of creation, something shifted within me. Not dramatically, not completely, but perceptibly, like the first green shoot emerging from winter-hardened ground. For the first time since the divorce, perhaps for the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own experience, engaged with my surroundings not as backdrop or context, but as participant and creator. The painting itself wasn't important. What mattered was the reconnection to a part of myself I had gradually surrendered, not because Richard had demanded it explicitly, but because maintaining his comfort and managing his moods had slowly consumed the energy and attention once devoted to my own creative expression. In the days that followed, I began sorting through the remaining boxes with new purpose, not just deciding what to keep or discard, but consciously curating the physical environment that would support this emerging version of myself. I donated clothes I had kept out of habit rather than preference. I rearranged furniture to maximize natural light. I hung artwork I loved, rather than pieces chosen to complement a particular decor scheme or satisfy someone else's aesthetic. These weren't dramatic acts of reinvention, but small reclamations, quiet assertions of agency after years of gradual surrender. They were the beginning of something I couldn't yet fully articulate, but could feel. Taking shape beneath the surface of daily routine, the foundation of a life defined by my own values and desires, rather than someone else's expectations. I didn't tell anyone about Richard's letter. Not my daughters, not my closest friends, not even my therapist initially. It was private knowledge, something I needed to integrate into my understanding of the past before sharing it with others. I wasn't protecting Richard by maintaining this silence. I was protecting my own process, giving myself time to absorb this new information without external interpretation shaping my response. Weeks passed, then months. I established new routines that honored both practical necessities and creative impulses. I accepted additional responsibilities at the Art Therapy Center, eventually transitioning from administrative support to program coordination for their senior outreach initiative. I joined a weekly painting group at the community center, where I met other women whose lives had similarly deviated from expected trajectories. Widows, divorcees, never marrieds, all navigating the terrain of self-definition in middle age. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, my center of gravity shifted from what had been lost to what remained possible, from past wounds to present capacities. This wasn't fairy tale transformation or dramatic rebirth. It was quieter, slower, more sustainable, the patient unfolding of a self long, constrained by external definitions but never completely erased. Sophie completed her freshman year at Cornell and spent the summer living in my apartment, the arrangement initially intended as temporary, but extending throughout the break, as we discovered a new dynamic unburdened by the tension that had characterized our family's final years together. We cooked elaborate meals in my small kitchen, took weekend road trips to nearby state parks, and spent evenings on the balcony discussing everything from environmental politics to relationship dynamics, to her emerging academic interests. One evening, as we sat sharing a bottle of wine while watching lightning flicker on the horizon, Sophie asked the question I had been anticipating for months. "Are you really okay, Mom? Not just managing or surviving, but actually okay?" I considered her question carefully, wanting to offer honesty without burdening her with complexities beyond her responsibility. "I'm more than okay," I said finally. "I'm becoming someone I recognize. Again, someone who got lost for a while but wasn't gone completely." Sophie nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. After a moment of comfortable silence, she added, "Dad seems happy with Victoria. They're talking about getting married next spring." There was hesitation in her voice, as if unsure how I would receive this information. A year earlier, perhaps even 6 months ago, the news might have landed like a physical blow. Final confirmation that the life I had built had been completely dismantled and replaced. But now, sitting in the gentle evening air with my daughter beside me, I found I could acknowledge Richard's new chapter without feeling diminished by it. "I hope they find what they're looking for," I said simply, and meant it. Not with saintly forgiveness or pretended indifference, but with the genuine understanding that his choices reflected his journey, not my worth. Sophie studied my face, perhaps searching for signs of hidden pain or unresolved bitterness. Finding none, she relaxed visibly, shoulders lowering, as if releasing a burden she had been carrying on my behalf. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you," she admitted. "Abby thought it might upset you. There was a time when it would have." I acknowledged, "But I'm in a different place now. Your father and I had 25 years together. We created you and Abby, which makes it all worthwhile, regardless of how it ended. What happens next in his life doesn't define mine anymore." She reached for my hand, squeezing it briefly before releasing it. "You're different now," she observed. "Stronger, I think, more." I don't know more. Present somehow. I smiled, recognizing the truth in her assessment. Sometimes losing what you thought you couldn't live without teaches you how much you're capable of surviving and eventually thriving. The conversation shifted to other topics. Her plans for the upcoming semester, a research position she was considering applying for, whether the approaching storm would deliver the rain our parched region desperately needed. But that moment of acknowledgement lingered significant, not for what was said, but for what no longer needed saying. That life continued after devastating loss. That identity could be reclaimed after systematic erasure, that new chapters could begin at any age. Later that night, after Sophie had retreated to her room, and the promised storm had arrived in earnest rain lashing against the windows, and thunder rumbling in the distance, I stood in my small living room, surveying the space I had created from the remnants of my previous life. It wasn't perfect or complete. There were still boxes to unpack, decisions to make, skills to relearn, but it was authentically mine, in a way no space had been for decades. I thought about Richard's pending marriage to Victoria, about the life they were building on the foundation of deceit and abandonment, and found I could wish them not happiness exactly, but perhaps eventual wisdom, not because I had achieved some transcendent state of forgiveness, but because continuing to center them in my emotional landscape, even through resentment or bitterness, would only extend their power over my present moment. Instead, I turned my attention to the small canvas I had been working on earlier that day, a study of light and shadow that wasn't quite working, despite multiple attempts to resolve its composition, with the storm providing dramatic accompaniment. I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I painted over the entire surface with a wash of deep blue, obliterating hours of careful detail. Work in favor of a fresh beginning. There was liberation in that act of creative destruction acknowledgement that sometimes progress requires releasing attachment to previous efforts, no matter how much time and care they had consumed. As the blue paint transformed the canvas into an ocean of possibility, I felt something settle within me. Not completion or arrival, but alignment. The understanding that the path forward wasn't about recovering what had been lost, but about creating something entirely new from the materials at hand. Richard's letter remained in its wooden box, no longer central to my daily thoughts, but preserved as historical record evidence, not just of his failures, but of my endurance. Daniel's flannel shirt hung in my closet, a tangible connection to the brother whose belief in me had never wavered, even when my own had faltered. Sophie's summer visit had demonstrated that family bonds could evolve rather than dissolve through upheaval, and I remained changed but continuous wounded, but healing no longer defined by absence but increasingly present to my own experience. Not because abandonment had somehow improved me, or betrayal had been disguised blessing, but because I had finally recognized what Daniel had seen all along, that survival itself was evidence of strength, and that strength once acknowledged could become foundation, rather than merely defense. The storm continued through the night, washing the summer dust from the city, and leaving behind air so clear it almost hurt to breathe it. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks without dreams or interruptions, and woke to morning light filtering through rain-washed windows, the beginning of another ordinary day that contained, like all days, the possibility of small discoveries and quiet revelations. And in that moment, with no audience or witness, I found myself smiling. Not because everything was resolved or perfect, but because I was finally awake to my own life, present to its texture and complexity, engaged with its unfolding rather than merely enduring its passage. And it wasn't happiness, exactly, at least not the simple, uncomplicated kind. It was something richer and more substantial, the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming authorship of my own story after years of allowing someone else to write the narrative. The work of becoming wasn't finished, would never be finished as long as breath remained in my body. But on that morning, with rain still dripping from eaves and birds beginning their post-storm conversations, I felt equal to the task for the first time in longer than I could remember. And that feeling, precious and hard-won, was victory enough for one ordinary Tuesday in the middle of a life being carefully, deliberately reconstructed. Something shifted after I discovered Richard's letter. Not all at once, not in dramatic fashion, but gradually, like seasons, changing almost imperceptible, day by day, yet transformative over time. The fog that had wrapped itself around my life since the divorce began to lift, not in sudden gusts of clarity, but in slow, steady clearings that revealed vistas I had forgotten existed. I began waking earlier, not from anxiety or insomnia, but from genuine anticipation for the day ahead. I established new routines that honored both practical necessities and creative impulses. Morning coffee on the balcony while watching the neighborhood come alive. Afternoon walks through the nearby arboretum, observing seasonal changes with an artist's attention to color and texture. Evenings alternating between social engagements and solitary creative work, both equally nurturing in different ways. The silence that had once seemed oppressive in my apartment gradually transformed into spaciousness room, to think, to create, to simply be, without constant adjustment to another's mood or preferences. I began to recognize this solitude not as absence or lack, but as presence, the fullness of my own company, the richness of undiluted experience. My relationship with art deepened and evolved. What had begun as tentative reconnection, occasional sketches, experimental color studies, small canvases that could be easily abandoned if unsuccessful, gradually developed into sustained practice. I transformed the second bedroom from generic guest space into a proper studio, installing track lighting for better visibility and shelving for organized supply storage. I established regular working hours, treating my creative practice with the same respect I had once reserved for more conventional responsibilities. I wasn't creating masterpieces or pursuing gallery representation. That wasn't the point. The value lay in the practice itself, in showing up consistently, in working through challenges rather than abandoning them, in rediscovering the conversation between eye and hand and heart that had once been as natural as breathing, before other priorities had gradually pushed it aside. My work at the Art Therapy Center evolved as well. What had begun as part-time administrative support to pay bills during the financial uncertainty following divorce gradually expanded into program development and facilitation. My background in art education, combined with personal experience of loss and renewal, proved unexpectedly valuable in designing workshops for individuals navigating major life transitions, retirement, bereavement, relationship changes, health challenges. I started a weekly watercolor class specifically for women over 50, creating safe space for exploration and experimentation without judgment or comparison. Most participants came not with professional aspirations, but with hunger for creative engagement, for connection, for reminders that growth remained possible. Regardless of age or circumstance, they arrived with varying levels of experience and natural ability, but shared common ground in their desire to reclaim aspects of themselves that had been set aside during years of prioritizing others' needs. In their company, listening to their stories between brushstrokes and color mixing, I found unexpected community women who understood from personal experience the complex terrain I was navigating, who had similarly discovered that endings could become thresholds rather than merely conclusions. We laughed together, occasionally cried, celebrated small breakthroughs, commiserated over persistent challenges, and gradually formed bonds based not on proximity or convenience, but on genuine recognition and mutual support. I also began saying no more frequently, and with less apology, declining invitations that didn't genuinely interest me, refusing to take responsibility for others' emotional comfort at my own expense, establishing boundaries around my time and energy that would have seemed impossibly selfish during my marriage, not from anger or bitterness, but from growing recognitions of my own worth and legitimate needs. No to Abby when she called, asking if I would attend a holiday gathering where Victoria would be present, explaining gently but firmly that while I wished her happy celebrations, I wasn't obligated to witness my replacement being welcomed into family traditions. I had established no to former friends who had sided with Richard during the divorce, and now sought reconnection without acknowledgement of their abandonment. No to my mother's subtle suggestion that perhaps I had given up too easily on a marriage she had never fully witnessed from the inside. These boundaries became not walls constructed in defensiveness, but necessary delineations clarifying where my responsibilities ended and others began. What constituted reasonable expectation versus inappropriate demand when compromise supported connection versus enabling disregard, not barriers against relationship, but foundations for healthier ones based on mutual respect rather than habitual accommodation. Financially, I moved from post-divorce uncertainty toward modest stability. The legal settlement had provided initial security but not long-term abundance. Richard's financial acumen had always included strategic planning that maximized his control of assets, while technically fulfilling legal obligations. I would never reclaim the material comfort I had known during marriage, but I gradually built something arguably more valuable: self-sufficiency, paired with simplified priorities that reduced anxiety about financial metrics. I sold jewelry I no longer wore, designer clothing that represented someone else's definition of appropriate presentation, decorative objects chosen for impression rather than personal significance. Not from necessity, though the additional funds proved useful, but from deepening commitment to authenticity, to surrounding myself only with items that reflected genuine preference rather than social performance or aspirational identity. I kept just one piece of jewelry from my marriage, the simple gold band Richard had placed on my finger 27 years earlier, before ambition and disillusionment had transformed him from passionate partner to strategic escape artist. Not from sentimentality or lingering attachment, but as historical artifact, tangible reminder of promises made and broken, of years invested and lessons purchased at significant cost. I placed it in a small wooden box along with Daniel's letter and Richard's confession, a time capsule of closure evidence, not of what endured, but of what had been survived. The divorce finalization came via certified mail on an ordinary Thursday morning legal language, confirming the official dissolution of a relationship that had effectively ended years before the papers were filed. I signed where indicated returned the appropriate copies to my attorney and spent the evening not in celebration or mourning, but in quiet acknowledgement. I opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for an unspecified special occasion, sat on my balcony as sunset painted the sky in improbable combinations of pink and gold, and allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of emotions. This milestone evoked gratitude for lessons learned, grief for dreams, abandoned pride in personal resilience, hope for continuing evolution. Sophie called that evening somehow, aware of the official date through either legal channels or her father's mention. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked, concern, evident even through the digital compression of the phone connection. "I'm more than okay," I assured her, meaning it completely, for perhaps the first time. This is just formal recognition of reality. The actual ending happened long ago. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, she said, her voice thoughtful. About endings and beginnings, how they're not always clear-cut. How sometimes they overlap or exist simultaneously. That's insightful, I replied, struck by her perception. Where did that reflection come from? She hesitated briefly before continuing. My psychology professor mentioned something called anticipatory grief. How people sometimes start mourning relationships while still technically in them when they sense an ending approaching but haven't named it yet. It made me think about you and Dad, how things changed long before anyone acknowledged it. The observation landed with unexpected force. Recognition of something I had experienced but never articulated so precisely. The gradual withdrawal of emotional investment, the incremental adjustment to absence even within physical presence, the subtle surrendering of expectations to avoid repetitive disappointment, all forms of anticipatory grief preparation for a loss already unfolding but not yet officially recognized. That's exactly it. I acknowledged, by the time your father actually left, I had already been grieving the marriage for years without realizing that's what I was doing. Which maybe explains why you've seemed, I don't know, more settled than I expected even early on. Sophie reflected. You had already done some of the emotional work without naming it. I think you're right. I agreed, appreciating both her insight and her willingness to engage with difficult realities, rather than avoiding them through platitudes or distraction. And what about you? How are you processing all of this? I'm okay, she said after brief consideration. Better than I expected, honestly. It helped seeing you rebuild rather than collapse, watching you create something new instead of just surviving what was lost. Her words carried more validation than any professional achievement or social recognition could have provided acknowledgement that my efforts to maintain dignity and purpose through upheaval had offered my daughter not just stability, but modeling for her own inevitable encounters with disappointment and redirection. We spoke for nearly an hour that evening, our conversation ranging from her academic interests to my developing art practice, to her complicated feelings about Richard's engagement to Victoria throughout. I maintained careful balance, validating her emotions without imposing my own narrative sharing perspective when invited, but respecting her right to form independent conclusions about her father's choices and their implications for her ongoing relationship with him. When we finally said goodnight, something had shifted subtly in our connection, an evolution from mother-daughter hierarchy towards something more balanced, a relationship between adults who shared history and blood, but increasingly met as individuals with separate perspectives and experiences. Not completion or arrival, but movement along a continuum that held promise for continuing development. In late October, as autumn painted the trees in dramatic golds and crimsons, I received unexpected communication from James Wilson, Richard's longtime attorney who had read portions of the will at his funeral. The heavy cream envelope bearing the law firm's embossed letterhead arrived with regular mail rather than certified delivery, suggesting personal correspondence rather than legal notification. Inside was a brief handwritten note on James's personal stationery. Rather than official letterhead, Ms. Crawford, I believe we should meet to discuss some additional matters related to Richard's estate planning that weren't appropriate to address immediately following his passing. Please contact my office at your convenience to arrange a time. Regards, James Wilson. The request was simultaneously vague and portentous, offering no specific information while clearly suggesting significance. My initial response was wariness. Remembering the public shock of the funeral announcement concerned, this might represent another unwelcome surprise delivered without preparation or context. After careful consideration, I called James's office and arranged a meeting for the following week, requesting morning appointment to allow maximum processing time for whatever information awaited. The intervening days brought occasional spikes of anxiety, moments of imagining worst-case scenarios or unexpected complications, but primarily a steady sense of readiness, confidence in my capacity to handle whatever emerged without being fundamentally destabilized by it. James's office occupied the 15th floor of a downtown high-rise, its reception area decorated in predictable law firm aesthetics, dark wood leather seating, discreetly expensive art, and strategically placed awards, suggesting both success and discretion. His assistant, a composed woman in her early 60s, escorted me to a conference room rather than private office, another subtle indicator that our meeting involved formal business rather than casual conversation. James himself appeared moments later, tall and lean in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that hadn't changed appreciably since Richard's funeral, though the setting rendered it appropriate rather than performatively somber. He greeted me with professional courtesy, shaking my hand firmly before gesturing toward the chair at the head of the conference table. "Thank you for coming, Miss Crawford." He began seating himself adjacent rather than opposite, a small but noticeable choice that suggested collaboration rather than confrontation. I apologize for the somewhat cryptic nature of my letter, but the matters we need to discuss are both sensitive and complex, best addressed in person rather than through written communication. I nodded, maintaining composed exterior despite quickening heartbeat. "I appreciate your discretion. What exactly are we discussing today?" James opened a leather portfolio, removing several documents organized with colored tabs. "As you're aware, I served as Richard's legal counsel for many years, including management of his estate planning and various financial arrangements. What you may not know is that approximately 14 months before his passing, Richard made significant revisions to his financial structures that weren't fully executed through the standard estate settlement." He paused, seemingly gauging my reaction before continuing. "Specifically, he established a separate trust under Delta Financial Holdings, a corporate entity not directly associated with his primary business interests or personal accounts. This trust named you as sole beneficiary, with specific instructions regarding both timing and conditions of disclosure." I sat very still, processing this unexpected information. "I don't understand. The divorce settlement was completed years ago. Why would Richard establish a trust for me without my knowledge, especially after everything that happened between us?" James cleared his throat, a gesture suggesting discomfort with emotional complexity rather than professional uncertainty. "I can't speak to his personal motivations. Ms. Crawford, I can only present the legal facts. Richard was methodical in his financial planning. Nothing he did was without careful consideration." He slid a document across the table, a trust agreement filled with legal terminology that would require careful review to fully comprehend. The trust contains two primary assets: full ownership of the Millfield property at 1826 Maple Street, which was transferred quietly before Victoria took residence, and a managed investment portfolio valued at approximately $480,000, established specifically for what Richard termed creative opportunities and artistic development for underrepresented women over 50. The information landed like physical impact, disorienting in its unexpectedness, confusing in its implications. The Millfield property had been our family home for nearly 20 years. The house I had left when Richard suggested space would benefit us both. Victoria had been living there since shortly after our separation, had presumably believed it would transfer to her following the marriage Richard had been planning before his sudden death, and the investment portfolio, nearly $500,000 designated specifically for supporting creative endeavors by older women, seemed almost pointed in its specificity, as if designed to address precisely the dreams and aspirations I had gradually surrendered during our marriage, as Richard's professional advancement took precedence over my creative development. "This doesn't make sense," I said finally, struggling to integrate this revelation with my understanding of the man who had so comprehensively dismantled our shared life. Why would he do this? And why keep it secret until after his death? James maintained professional neutrality, neither endorsing my confusion nor offering personal interpretation. The trust documentation includes a letter of intent that may address some of your questions. He said, removing a sealed envelope from his portfolio and placing it before me. This was to be delivered only after confirmation of the trust's legal status, which my office completed last week. The envelope bore my name in Richard's distinctive handwriting, precise capital letters, slight rightward slant pressure that left subtle impression on the heavy paper. I stared at it for long moments, strangely reluctant to discover its contents, uncertain whether they would offer genuine insight or simply another carefully constructed narrative designed to manage others' perceptions. "Would you prefer privacy?" James asked quietly, already half rising from his chair in apparent recognition of the moment's emotional weight. I nodded gratefully. "Yes, please, I'll call if I have questions." Alone in the conference room, I opened the envelope with careful movements, removing a single sheet of the personalized stationery Richard had used for important correspondence throughout his professional life. The letter was dated approximately 16 months before his death, written in his own hand rather than dictated to an assistant or produced by word processor. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, circumstances have aligned as planned, and James has explained the trust arrangements established in your name. I imagine you're experiencing confusion, perhaps anger, certainly suspicion regarding my motivations, all warranted given our history. I won't insult your intelligence with claims of deathbed regret or sudden moral awakening. The truth is both simpler and more complex. I recognized too late for meaningful repair that our marriage ended. Not because you were lacking, but because I was the narrative I constructed of the demanding wife, the impractical artist. The emotional burden was projection rather than reality. You were constant while I was changing, grounded, while I was increasingly untethered from any values beyond accumulation and advancement. The house is rightfully yours, not as compensation for years lost or pain inflicted, which cannot be quantified or repaid, but as recognition of truth. You created home there, not just through physical arrangement, but through presence and care that rendered walls and floors into sanctuary. My claiming it during divorce proceedings was final evidence of my fundamental selfishness, taking what I hadn't built and couldn't maintain, except in material sense. The investment fund represents not generosity, but partial restoration resources that should have supported your development alongside mine throughout our years together. Had I not gradually prioritized my ambitions while relegating yours to hobby status? Its structure ensures Victoria cannot contest or access it, as several of my other assets were deliberately positioned within her potential claim. This isn't redemption, Eleanor. I harbor no illusions about posthumous forgiveness or legacy rehabilitation. It's simply what should have been done years ago, when it might have meant something beyond practical benefit. I arranged it this way, revealed only after my death because I lacked courage to face you directly with this acknowledgement while living. The man you married disappeared long before our legal separation, eroded by ambition, comfort with compromise, gradual surrender to easier choices over right ones. What remained was a poor substitution skilled in accumulation, but increasingly bankrupt in every measure that matters. You deserved better partnership than I provided, greater recognition than I offered, fuller life than I allowed space for. Richard, I read the letter 3 times each pass, revealing nuances missed in initial impact, Not apology exactly. Richard had never been comfortable with direct expressions of remorse, but acknowledgement far more comprehensive than I had expected from a man whose primary skill had ultimately been self-justification and strategic narrative construction. The practical implications were significant property ownership, financial security potential, expansion of arts programming beyond what limited resources had previously allowed. But the emotional implications were more complex, requiring integration with existing understanding rather than simple acceptance or rejection. This wasn't redemption, as Richard himself had acknowledged. No material provision could restore years spent diminishing myself to accommodate his expanding sense of entitlement. No posthumous recognition could heal the wounds inflicted through systematic invalidation of my perceptions and needs. The trust didn't transform him from selfish abandoner to misunderstood benefactor. It merely added complicating dimension to an already complex portrait. When James returned approximately 20 minutes later, I had composed myself sufficiently to engage with practical considerations. "I'll need to review these documents carefully with my own attorney," I said, indicating the trust paperwork he had provided. "And I'll have questions about tax implications and administrative requirements for the investment fund." He nodded, visibly relieved at my focus on logistics rather than emotional processing. "Of course, my office can arrange direct consultation with the trust administrator whenever you're ready. There's no immediate deadline for decisions. The arrangements are structured to provide flexibility regarding timing. I gathered the materials securing them in my portfolio with methodical attention that helped maintain exterior composure despite internal turbulence. "Thank you for your discretion in handling this," I said as I prepared to leave. "I appreciate the sensitivity of the situation. Professional ethics demand nothing less." James replied with formal correctness that nonetheless conveyed genuine respect. As I reached the door, he added with uncharacteristic hesitation, "Miss Crawford, for whatever it's worth, Richard was not the same man in his final years that he had been during most of our professional association. Whatever personal failings led to your separation, I believe he experienced genuine recognition of them before his death." I paused, considering this unexpected personal observation from someone who had maintained strict professional boundaries throughout our interaction. Recognition without action is just another form of self-indulgence. I said finally, not with bitterness, but with the clarity hard experience had purchased. But I appreciate the intention behind telling me, leaving the building, stepping into autumn sunshine that rendered the city momentarily golden. I experienced strange dislocation, as if the solid ground of reality had shifted slightly beneath my feet, requiring recalibration of balance and perspective. The trust's existence didn't fundamentally change my daily reality or future direction, but it altered the context surrounding prior experiences, adding unexpected complexity to a narrative I had finally begun to integrate into coherent understanding. I walked several blocks before finding an empty bench in a small park near the riverfront, needing physical space to process. Before returning to regular responsibilities, sitting in dappled sunlight, filtering through nearly bare maple branches, watching fallen leaves skitter across concrete in erratic patterns determined by shifting breeze. I considered what this development meant, not just practically, but existentially. The house in Millfield's scene of both profound connection and painful dissolution. Physical embodiment of family history and marital failure was now legally mine, though Victoria presumably still occupied it. Likely unaware of its changed ownership status, the investment fund offered financial security. I hadn't anticipated resources that could significantly expand creative programming for women whose artistic development had been similarly delayed or interrupted by family and financial priorities. But beyond these tangible assets lay more complex implications. Richard's acknowledgement, however belated and safely posthumous, that the failure of our marriage had stemmed primarily from his choices rather than my deficiencies. His recognition never expressed during life, but documented beyond potential misinterpretation, that the narrative he had constructed of my excessive emotion, impracticality, limitation had been self-serving fiction rather than objective reality. This acknowledgement didn't heal wounds already formed or restore years already lost. It didn't transform betrayal into miscommunication or abandonment into justified departure. But it offered something I hadn't realized I still needed: external validation of perceptions. I had doubted, despite mounting evidence, confirmation that the gaslighting I had experienced wasn't imagined exaggeration, but deliberate strategy. For years I had worked to rebuild self-trust, damaged through systematic invalidation, to reclaim confidence in my own experiences and interpretations. Despite Richard's consistent framing of my emotional responses as excessive or irrational, I had largely succeeded through combination of therapy, supportive community, and personal discipline, developing internal validation, independent of external confirmation. Yet receiving this unequivocal acknowledgement not from Richard directly, which would have invited skepticism regarding potential manipulation, but through legal documentation and private correspondence, never intended for public performance, provided unexpected reinforcement of this rebuilt self-trust. Not because I needed his validation to confirm my worth, but because external verification of deliberately distorted reality offered final resolution to lingering cognitive dissonance. As afternoon light shifted toward evening gold, I made several decisions I would proceed carefully but deliberately with claiming the assets Richard had designated for me. I would consult appropriate legal counsel regarding both property transfer and investment fund administration. I would develop thoughtful strategy for addressing Victoria's likely shock and potential animosity upon learning of changed ownership status for the home she had presumably expected to inherit. But most importantly, I would integrate this new information without allowing it to fundamentally alter the path I had been constructing since the divorce, the careful, intentional rebuilding of identity and purpose, independent of Richard's influence or approval. His posthumous acknowledgement, while meaningful in certain respects, would remain contextual rather than central to my continuing evolution. I wouldn't use the trust as platform for public vindication or private revenge. I wouldn't leverage property ownership to inflict displacement or uncertainty on Victoria. Regardless of her role in my marriage's dissolution, I wouldn't allow Richard's belated material provision to redefine relationships with daughters still navigating their own complex feelings about their father's choices and legacy. Instead, I would proceed with the balanced perspective hard-earned through experience recognition that people rarely fit neat categories of hero or villain, that relationships contain multitudes beyond simple dichotomies of right and wrong, that healing occurs not through external validation, but through internal integration of experience into coherent self-understanding that accommodates complexity without surrendering discernment. Walking back toward the parking garage where I'd left my car, I felt strange lightness. Not happiness, exactly. Not even particularly positive emotion, but something adjacent to relief. Not because Richard's posthumous provision changed fundamental reality, but because it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that the failure of our marriage reflected his limitations more than mine. That my perceived deficiencies had been largely projection rather than accurate assessment. That the work of rebuilding I had undertaken since separation represented genuine strength rather than mere adaptation to abandonment. The sun was setting as I drove home, painting the western sky in dramatic combination of orange and purple that no artist would dare invent for fear of appearing excessive. Traffic moved with typical evening heaviness. Other drivers likely focused on mundane concerns, dinner preparations, children's homework, evening routines, while I carried knowledge that had fundamentally shifted my understanding of the past decade. Arriving home, I placed the trust documents and Richard's letter in the wooden box that already contained Daniel's note and the unsent confession discovered earlier. Together, they formed archive of a relationship not comprehensive or objective, but sufficiently complex to resist simple characterization. Not evidence to be revisited regularly, but documentation preserved for potential future reference should questions arise or memory prove unreliable. That evening I didn't call anyone to share the news. Not Sophie or Abby, not friends from my painting group, not colleagues from the art center. The information felt too significant for immediate dissemination. Too complex for casual conversation, too potentially disruptive to relationships still finding equilibrium after years of upheaval. Instead, I opened windows to admit cool evening air, prepared simple dinner from ingredients already on hand, and spent several hours at my easel working on a landscape series inspired by autumn's transition. Not literal representation, but emotional response to seasonal transformation, to the particular beauty found in process of temporary diminishment preceding renewal. Working steadily focused on color relationships and compositional balance rather than specific outcome, I experienced familiar meditative state where external concerns receded while present awareness expanded. The painting that emerged wasn't revolutionary or technically flawless, simply honest engagement with materials and process, authentic expression, unconcerned with external evaluation or predetermined outcome. But in that honest engagement lay something increasingly precious: the reclamation of creative voice separate from practical function or others' approval. The recovery of relationship with self that had been gradually surrendered during years focused primarily on maintaining others' comfort and security. Richard's posthumous provision couldn't restore those years or heal resulting wounds. No material asset could compensate for systematic diminishment or strategic invalidation. But perhaps it offered something adjacent to justice. Not dramatic vindication or public redemption, but quiet confirmation that perception hadn't been, delusion that trust had been breached rather than foolishly extended, that the failure had existed in betrayal rather than inherent unworthiness. As midnight approached, I cleaned brushes with methodical attention, arranged workspace for morning return, and prepared for sleep, with awareness that tomorrow would require decisions about how to proceed with newfound resources and responsibilities. Not with anxiety or overwhelm, but with grounded confidence and capacity to navigate complexity without becoming subsumed by it. Whatever Richard's true motivations, genuine remorse strategic legacy management, or complex combination beyond simple categorization, his final provision offered not redemption, but possibility opportunity to channel resources toward supporting others, navigating similar terrain of delayed development and reclaimed purpose. Not because his acknowledgement was necessary for continuing evolution, but because additional resources could expand impact beyond previous limitations. And in that expansion lay something adjacent to resolution, not forgiveness exactly, not erasure of legitimate grievance, but redirection of energy from past injury toward future possibility. Not because hurt had been adequately addressed or damage fully repaired, but because continuing to center past wounds would only extend their impact into present potential as sleep approached, bringing temporary cessations of conscious processing. I found myself holding not anger or vindication, but something adjacent to peace, not complete or permanent, but sufficient for present moment. Not because Richard deserved absolution or his actions warranted dismissal, but because maintaining righteous indignation would require continuing investment of limited emotional resources, better directed toward present engagement and future development. The house, the investment fund, the belated acknowledgement all would require careful integration into continuing narrative rather than wholesale redefinition of established understanding. Like autumn's transformation of landscape through subtle daily changes, culminating in dramatic seasonal shift, this development would influence trajectory without determining destination. Tomorrow would bring practical considerations, logistical challenges, potential confrontations. But tonight, in quiet darkness of apartment that had become genuine home, rather than mere shelter, I allowed awareness to settle into physical present. The weight of blankets, the rhythm of breathing, the distant urban sounds filtering through partially opened windows, not escaping complexity through denial or distraction, but temporarily setting aside analysis to experience unmediated being. And in that experience lay not conclusion, but continuation, not dramatic closure, but incremental healing, not arrival, but ongoing journey toward integrated selfhood, capable of encompassing both wound and recovery, both betrayal and resilience, both ending and beginning. Not because suffering contained inherent purpose or abandonment offered disguised opportunity, but because rebuilding after devastation revealed capacities previously untested and therefore unknown. Sleep came gradually, thoughts slowing like settling sediment consciousness, releasing analytical grip to allow deeper integration beyond rational processing. Tomorrow would bring new chapter, neither defined by past limitation, nor magically transformed through material provision, but offering expanded possibilities for continuing evolution toward authentic expression and meaningful contribution. The work of becoming that constitutes life's essential purpose, regardless of circumstance or condition. The reverberations of Richard's posthumous provision spread gradually through interconnected lives, like ripples expanding from stone, dropped in still water, each circle representing different relationship, affected in distinct ways by this unexpected development. Victoria's reaction came first arriving via certified letter from her attorney, 3 days after my meeting with James Wilson. The communication was coldly formal, simultaneously threatening legal action while tacitly acknowledging limited grounds for contesting the trust's legitimacy. Between carefully crafted paragraphs of professional legalese lay barely contained fury, the rage of someone who had believed herself securely positioned, only to discover foundation built on shifting sand. I responded through my own attorney with measured reasonableness, offering 3 months occupancy to arrange alternative housing waiving any retroactive rent claims, providing assurance that personal possessions would remain undisturbed during transition. Not from saintly forgiveness or strategic self-positioning, but from genuine disinterest in prolonging conflict or inflicting unnecessary disruption, even on someone who had participated in dismantling my previous life. Victoria made no direct contact during the negotiated transition period. The house was vacated precisely at agreed deadline, yet left in impeccable condition that suggested both professional cleaning service and deliberate demonstration of superior domestic standards. The only personal communication was post-it note affixed to kitchen counter. He told me it was already settled in the divorce. Just so you know, whether intended as exoneration or accusation, remained ambiguous, perhaps deliberately so. Telling my daughters proved more complicated than anticipated, requiring careful balance between transparency and sensitivity to their continuing relationships with Richard's memory and legacy. I arranged separate conversations rather than joint disclosure, recognizing their different processing styles and varying degrees of connection with their father's financial affairs. Sophie responded with characteristic thoughtfulness when I explained the situation during weekend visit to her campus. So Dad basically admitted he was wrong, but only after making sure he wouldn't have to face any consequences for it. She summarized her perception, cutting through potential confusion to essential truth. That's actually exactly like him. I'm not sure what to do with the house. I admitted grateful for her clear-eyed assessment. It feels strange to claim ownership of something I walked away from years ago, but equally strange to sell property with so much family history attached to it. She considered this while we walked across Campus Quad, autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet. Why not use it? She suggested finally, not to live in, necessarily, but maybe convert part of it into studio space for your women's art program. It has that huge sunroom that would be perfect for workshops, and all those bedrooms could become individual studios. The suggestion landed with unexpected rightness, practical utilization that honored both properties' history and potential future purpose. Not reclamation of past identity, but redirection toward emerging vision, using resources provided to create something entirely new from familiar foundation. Abby's reaction, delivered via tense phone call after delayed response to my message requesting conversation, contained more complicated emotions. So he just gave you the house, after everything, without telling Victoria. Her tone conveyed simultaneous disbelief and defensive skepticism, as if suspecting my account contained deliberate distortion. I was as surprised as you are. I assured her, maintaining calm despite her implicit accusation. The trust documents were created over a year before his death, completely separate from his regular estate planning. Victoria is devastated. She countered loyalty to her father's chosen partner, evident in protective anger. She's had to find somewhere else to live with. Basically no warning. I corrected gently but firmly. She received 3 months' notice and legal assurance that her possessions would remain undisturbed during transition. I've made every effort to handle this respectfully. Despite the awkward circumstances, silence stretched between us heavy with unspoken history and competing narratives. Abby had aligned herself with Richard's perspective during divorce, accepting his framing of events without seeking alternative viewpoint or questioning convenient characterizations. His posthumous acknowledgement of wrongdoing now threatened carefully constructed understandings she had built to justify continued anger toward me. I have a copy of the letter he included with the trust documents. I offered finally, "I'm happy to share it if you want to understand his thinking directly, rather than hearing it through my interpretation. Maybe someday." She replied, voice softening slightly, though resistance remained evident. "I just need time to process this. Take whatever time you need." I said, resisting impulse to push for immediate reconciliation or understanding. I'm not going anywhere. Professional relationships brought different considerations as news gradually spread through interconnected networks. Colleagues at the Art Center responded with mixture of excitement regarding expanded programming possibilities and practical concerns about implementation challenges. Friends from Painting Group offered varying perspectives ranging from vindicated satisfaction to cautious warnings about potential complications of increased resources and responsibilities. Through it all, I maintained internal compass, calibrated through years of post-divorce rebuilding, aware of others' perspectives without becoming defined by them, considerate of various needs without sacrificing hard-won boundaries, grateful for unexpected resources without allowing them to fundamentally alter carefully constructed identity, independent of Richard's influence or legacy. The Millfield house required significant attention after Victoria's departure, not because she had left it damaged, but because transformation from family residence to creative workspace demanded structural and aesthetic modifications. I hired Sophie's friend Marco, recently graduated with architectural degree, to design renovation that would preserve historical character while accommodating new purpose. "The bones are excellent," he observed during initial walkthrough, examining original woodwork with appreciative attention. "We won't need to modify load-bearing elements, just reconfigure some interior walls to create better flow between potential studio spaces." Working within budget established from investment funds' initial distribution, we developed phased approach immediate safety and accessibility improvements, followed by gradual transformation of individual rooms into specialized workshop spaces for different artistic disciplines. The former living room with its northern exposure became painting studio dining room, transformed into space for sculpture and three-dimensional projects. Upstairs bedrooms converted to individual workspaces available through application process for women needing dedicated creative environment. Throughout renovation process, I found myself experiencing unexpected emotional responses to physical spaces that contained concentrated personal history. Sophie's childhood bedroom, with growth measurements still penciled on closet door frame kitchen, where countless family meals had been prepared and consumed. Garden where I had spent meditative hours cultivating plants that had long since been replaced by Victoria's preferred landscaping. These moments arrived unpredictably triggered by seemingly innocent details. Distinctive creaking of third stair from bottom, particular quality of afternoon light. Through leaded glass windows, scent of lemon oil used on original woodwork. Not debilitating grief or bitter resentment, but quieter recognition of life that had once existed within these walls. The genuine love and connection that had predated eventual dissolution. The legitimate joy and shared purpose that had characterized early years before gradual erosion. I didn't suppress these responses or castigate myself for experiencing them. Instead, I acknowledged each with quiet attention before returning focus to present purpose and future potential. Not denying history's reality or its continuing influence, but refusing to remain defined by relationships and identities that no longer served continuing evolution. 6 months after receiving news of Richard's trust renovations, reached sufficient completion to host inaugural event in repurposed space weekend workshop titled Reclamation Finding Creative Voice. After 50, 23 women participated, ranging in age from 51 to 78, each bringing unique history of creative deferral and renewed commitment to artistic expression, standing before them in what had once been my family's living room, now transformed into light-filled studio space. With easels arranged in semicircle and supply tables, positioned for optimal accessibility, I experienced profound sense of alignment, as if disparate elements of personal history had finally coalesced into coherent purpose, transcending individual narrative. Welcome to the Crawford Center for Creative Renewal. I began the name deliberately chosen to honor Daniel's belief in my capacity for regeneration, rather than Richard's belated material provision. We gather in this space not to pursue professional validation or technical perfection, but to reclaim relationship with creative practice after years or decades of necessary deferral. Throughout that weekend, watching these women engage with materials and processes many hadn't touched. Since youth, I witnessed transformations both subtle and profound, hesitation gradually replaced by confident engagement, self-conscious apology giving way to focused absorption, isolation transformed through shared purpose, and mutual recognition. They created works reflecting widely varying skill levels and aesthetic preferences. Some technically accomplished, others charmingly awkward, all authentic expressions of individual perception and experience. More significantly, they formed connections across differences in background and circumstance, recognizing common patterns in their creative histories despite disparate details. I stopped painting when my third child was born. Shared Patricia, retired nurse with silver hair and quiet dignity. There never seemed to be enough time, enough energy, enough space, either physical or mental. By the time they were grown, I had convinced myself it was too late to start again. Murmurs of recognition circled the room. Women nodding in understanding of sacrifice, so normalized it had barely registered as choice, rather than inevitable surrender. Not because creative expression mattered more than family commitment or professional responsibility, but because its systematic deferral represented broader pattern of self-diminishment, justified through others' needs and priorities. I told myself I was being practical. Offered Catherine, recently retired accountant exploring watercolor, with methodical attention to technical properties, that creative pursuits were luxury rather than necessity, that responsible adults focused on tangible contributions rather than personal expression. More nods, more murmured agreement, recognition of internalized narratives that had justified gradual surrender of essential self-expression while elevating practical function as primary measure of worthwhile existence. Not because providers and caretakers deserved less personal fulfillment, but because cultural messaging had consistently positioned their needs as indulgent rather than legitimate. Throughout the weekend, I shared elements of my own journey, without centering personal narrative or positioning myself as inspirational exemplar. I acknowledged both losses, experienced and strengths discovered, both external obstacles encountered and internal limitations gradually transcended. Not to elicit sympathy or demonstrate superior resilience, but to establish authentic connection through shared vulnerability and hard-earned insight, Reclamation isn't about recovering exactly what was surrendered. I explained during closing session Sunday afternoon. It's about recognizing that creative capacity remains available regardless of interruption duration or technical rustiness. The voice that's emerging now contains wisdom unavailable to younger self perspective that transforms apparent limitation into unique advantage as participants departed, many lingering to exchange contact information or express appreciation for unexpected breakthroughs. Experienced, I stood in doorway of house that had witnessed both my gradual diminishment and eventual rebuilding, not with triumphant satisfaction or vindicated righteousness, but with quiet recognition of journey's continuing nature, understanding that reclamation represented not destination, but ongoing process of integration and expression. Sophie arrived that evening to help with post-workshop organization, and cleanup, having arranged weekend visit specifically to witness inaugural program. We worked together in comfortable companionship, restoring order to studio spaces while discussing participants' experiences and potential refinements for future workshops. "You seem different," she observed as we shared simple dinner on newly constructed patio behind house. "Not just since Dad died or even since the trust revelation. Something more fundamental." I considered her observation carefully, respecting its perceptiveness while searching for accurate response. "I think I've finally integrated all the separate pieces of my experience." I said finally, not in perfect resolution or complete healing, but in way that acknowledges both injury sustained and strength discovered through rebuilding. She nodded, understanding evident in her expression. "You're not defined by what happened anymore, not as victim or survivor, or even ex-wife. You've become something entirely new that includes those experiences without being limited by them." Her articulation captured exactly what I had been working toward, without fully recognizing its manifestation integration that transcended both identification with injury and performative overcoming of it. Not because painful experiences had been erased or their impacts minimized, but because continuing growth had gradually incorporated them into more expansive identity, not primarily defined by relationship to past wounds. "That's exactly it," I confirmed, grateful for her perception and its accurate articulation. "And what about you? How are you integrating everything that's happened?" She considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I'm still figuring it out, honestly. Sometimes I'm angry at Dad for the choices he made for not being the person I thought he was. Other times I find myself making excuses for him or minimizing the impact of his actions." She paused, watching evening light fade across garden she had once played in as child. "But mostly I'm grateful for what I've learned about resilience from watching you rebuild without becoming bitter." The acknowledgement touched me deeply, not because I needed validation for choices made or approaches taken, but because it confirmed Sophie had received something valuable from witnessing difficult journey, navigated with intentional dignity, rather than either passive acceptance or reactive bitterness. "Your father wasn't entirely who I initially believed him to be," I said carefully, "but he wasn't entirely who he became during our final years together, either." People contain multitudes, contradictions, capacity for both tremendous generosity and profound selfishness within same consciousness. Understanding that complexity doesn't excuse harmful choices, but it does allow for more nuanced relationship with memory and legacy. She nodded, absorbing this perspective with visible consideration. "That's what I'm working toward, I think. Not black and white judgment or simplified narrative, but acceptance of complicated reality, where someone can simultaneously cause significant harm and demonstrate genuine regret without fully repairing damage inflicted. Exactly. I confirmed, recognizing wisdom beyond her years in this balanced assessment. And that capacity to hold seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously might be most valuable skill any of us can develop for navigating complex relationships and inevitable disappointments. We fell into comfortable silence, watching darkness gradually claim garden, while contemplating individual relationships to shared history. Not with perfect resolution or complete understanding, but with growing capacity to accommodate complexity without either dismissing legitimate hurt or remaining permanently defined by it. 2 years after Richard's death, 3 significant developments, a marked continuing evolution of circumstances set in motion by his posthumous provision, Abby finally requested copy of letter accompanying trust documents. Victoria announced engagement to financial advisor she had apparently been seeing since before Richard's passing, and Crawford Center received national recognition for innovative programming, supporting creative renewal for women in second half of life. Each development represented continuing ripple effect from original revelation. Separate circles expanding at different rates, according to unique conditions and individual processing timelines. Not dramatic resolution or cinematic closure, but ongoing integration of unexpected circumstances into evolving narratives, shaped partly by deliberate intention and partly by unpredictable external factors. Abby's request arrived via text message on ordinary Tuesday morning. I think I'm ready to read Dad's letter, if you're still willing to share it. Simple communication, containing complex implications, openness to perspective, potentially challenging, carefully constructed understanding, willingness to encounter complexity previously avoided through simplified narrative. I sent digital copy without elaborate commentary, adding only brief note. Take whatever time you need with this. I'm available when and if you want to discuss it. Respecting her process without demanding particular response or timeline, acknowledging significance without emphasizing potential impact. 3 weeks passed without further communication period I recognized as necessary integration time, rather than deliberate avoidance or rejection. When response finally came, it arrived not through text or email, but through unexpected visit to Crawford Center during weekday afternoon when regular classes were in session, but administrative responsibilities kept me primarily in converted study now serving as office space. She appeared in doorway without appointment or advance notice expression, containing complicated mixture of emotion that suggested significant internal processing. I've read it 4 times, she said without preamble, referring to Richard's letter, without needing specific identification. I'm still trying to reconcile it with the version of Dad I've been holding on to. I gestured toward comfortable seating arrangement designed for consultation with program participants, giving her space to continue without interruption or direction. She sat hands clasped tightly in lap, unconsciously mirroring posture I had maintained during countless difficult conversations throughout divorce process. He was so convincing. She continued after gathering thoughts. About you being emotionally unstable, about your supposed inability to adapt to changing circumstances, about how he had tried everything to make things work before finally giving up. She looked up, meeting my gaze directly. For perhaps first time since separation had forced family realignment. I believed him completely. It was easier than considering alternatives. We believe what helps us maintain coherent understanding of our world. I offered not as excuse, but as recognition of universal psychological process, especially when alternative would require reconsidering fundamental assumptions about people we love and depend upon. She nodded, tears gathering, but not falling. I've been so angry at you for so long, for supposedly abandoning him, for allegedly being impossible to please, for apparently making him choose between personal happiness and family stability. Her voice broke slightly before steadying with visible effort. When all along he was creating narrative that protected him from accountability for his own choices, I wanted to reach for her hand to offer physical comfort, alongside verbal recognition, but restrained impulse allowing her to navigate emotional territory without premature intervention or forced intimacy. Your anger was based on information you had available, interpreted through lens of relationship you had with both of us. That's completely understandable. But I never asked for your perspective. She countered, genuine regret evident in her expression. I never considered that there might be another side to the story I just accepted, what was convenient and comfortable to believe. You were 22 when we separated. I reminded her gently, still forming adult identity, naturally aligned with father, whose approval had always been conditional on meeting specific expectations. Those dynamics aren't easily recognized from inside them. Conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, exploring complicated territory of family mythology, selective narrative, emotional manipulation, disguised as rational assessment, not with bitter accusation or dramatic revelation, but with measured evaluation of patterns previously invisible through normalization and strategic framing. I'm not asking you to choose sides now, I assured her as discussion gradually moved toward conclusion. Your relationship with your father's memory is yours to define based on full experience with him, not just elements I found difficult or damaging. He was genuinely proud of you, consistently supportive of your ambitions in ways he wasn't with other aspects of his life. But that doesn't erase what he did to you, she said quietly, or how I participated in narrative that caused additional pain through withdrawal and judgment without investigation. No, it doesn't erase those things. I agreed. But understanding complexity allows integration rather than compartmentalization, accepting both genuine connection experienced and legitimate harm inflicted as equally real aspects of same relationship. When she left that afternoon, our parting embrace contained tentative beginning of reconstruction, not immediate resolution of years-long estrangement, but opening toward potential reconnection based on more balanced understanding and mutual recognition. Not because Richard's posthumous acknowledgement had magically healed family fractures, but because willingness to encounter uncomfortable truths had created possibility for authentic relationship previously impossible through selective narrative and unexamined assumptions. Victoria's engagement announcement arrived through social media rather than direct communication professional photograph, featuring beaming couple against neutral backdrop, accompanied by standard declarations of joy and anticipation. Not particularly noteworthy, except for timing almost exactly 2 years after Richard's passing, suggesting relationship either predated his death or developed with remarkable efficiency during presumed grieving period. I experienced no jealousy or resentment upon seeing announcement, only mild curiosity regarding narrative being constructed around transition from widow to fiancé. Not because Victoria's personal life held particular interest, but because patterns of presentation and perception offered continuing insight into how seemingly private relationships existed within broader social contexts. Comment section beneath announcement contained expected congratulations alongside subtle variations of surprise regarding timeline indirect references to moving forward and finding happiness again so soon, suggesting collective awareness of potential impropriety while avoiding direct questioning of circumstances. Victoria's responses maintained careful balance between acknowledging appropriate mourning and celebrating new beginning strategic narrative management reminiscent of Richard's approach to public perception. I neither commented nor contacted her directly, maintaining respectful distance established during property transition. Her life trajectory held no particular relevance to mine beyond historical connection through shared relationship with Richard connection that required neither ongoing engagement nor deliberate severance, simply recognition of gradually diminishing significance as separate lives continued along divergent paths. Crawford Center's recognition came through feature article in National Magazine focused on innovative approaches to arts education and community engagement. Journalists spent 3 days observing programs, interviewing participants, and documenting transformed spaces that balanced historical architectural elements with contemporary functional design. Resulting piece highlighted not just physical facility and educational offerings, but underlying philosophy of creative reclamation and deliberate community building. What makes the Crawford Center unique? Wrote reporter with genuine insight, isn't merely its programming for underserved demographic or its beautiful facility, but founder Eleanor Crawford's fundamental recognition that creative renewal represents essential human need rather than luxury indulgence. Participants repeatedly describe experience not as hobby development, but as vital reconnection with core aspects of identity, temporarily surrendered to practical demands of adult responsibility. Article generated immediate response inquiries about program replication in other communities, applications from potential participants beyond local geographic area interview requests, from additional publications interested in exploring themes of midlife reinvention and creative reclamation. Not overwhelming tsunami, demanding immediate capacity expansion, but steady stream, indicating genuine resonance with identified but previously unaddressed need. I approached resulting opportunities with measured enthusiasm, accepting speaking engagements that aligned with core mission developing mentorship program for other communities interested in establishing similar centers, creating online resources for women unable to access physical location, not from grandiose ambition or hunger for recognition, but from genuine commitment to expanding access to transformative experiences initially made possible through unusual circumstances of Richard's posthumous provision. 3 years after his death, I found myself in position never anticipated during either marriage or immediate aftermath of separation, directing growing organization dedicated to supporting women's creative renewal, maintaining thoughtfully designed living space, separate from workplace, enjoying reconstructed relationships with both daughters, while continuing to develop personal artistic practice alongside facilitation of others' creative journeys. This life wasn't what I had envisioned when standing beside Richard at altar 27 years earlier. Pledging partnership I had believed would define remainder of earthly existence. It wasn't what I had feared during darkest moments, following separation when future appeared shapeless, void containing only absence and diminishment. It wasn't even what I had cautiously projected during initial post-divorce rebuilding, when survival itself represented primary achievement, with occasional moments of genuine pleasure considered significant victory. Instead, it was something I couldn't have imagined from any previous vantage point. Unique integration of experiences, both painful and transformative capabilities, both innate and developed through necessity relationships, both reconstructed from previous damage and newly formed through authentic connection. Not because suffering itself had contained inherent purpose or abandonment had offered disguised opportunity, but because response to devastation had gradually revealed capacities previously untested and therefore unknown. On evening marking 3rd anniversary of Richard's death, I sat alone on balcony of apartment that had transformed from emergency shelter to genuine sanctuary. Not from deliberate commemoration or ritualized remembrance, but because date itself retained significance beyond conscious intention, marker of transition that had initiated sequence of developments culminating in current circumstances. I held no bitterness as twilight gradually deepened toward night, stars emerging in darkening sky, while city lights created competing constellation below. Not because injury had been insignificant or betrayal easily dismissed, but because continuing to center past wounds would only extend their impact into present possibility. Not forgiveness exactly that would require request never offered, and reconciliation never possible, but liberation from burden of resentment that would otherwise continue limiting available emotional energy for current engagement and future development. Richard's life and death, his betrayal and belated acknowledgement, his presence and absence all had contributed to current reality without determining its essential quality or future direction. Like water shaping stone through persistent contact, experience had gradually formed present consciousness through combination of external circumstances and internal response, creating unique formation impossible to precisely replicate or fundamentally alter. Once established, I raised glass containing single measure of good bourbon. Richard's preferred evening ritual I had adopted not from sentimental connection, but from simple appreciation of tradition worth maintaining. Not toast exactly, not celebration or commiseration, but quiet acknowledgement of journey traversed and continuing path ahead, not defined by what had been lost or even what had been found, but by capacity to integrate all experiences, painful and joyful, devastating and transformative, into coherent identity, capable of both receiving and offering genuine connection. Stars continued emerging overhead as night fully claimed, sky eternal patterns, unchanged by temporal circumstances, unfolding beneath their distant light. I remained on balcony until temperature dropped enough to encourage retreat. Indoors, where carefully curated space reflected both aesthetic preferences and practical considerations, environment designed to support continuing evolution rather than commemorate either past identity or present achievement. Tomorrow would bring normal responsibilities and opportunities, administrative decisions at Crawford Center, progress on personal painting series, exploring transformation through seasonal imagery scheduled, video call with Sophie to discuss summer workshop. She had proposed focusing on intergenerational creative collaboration, ordinary activities containing neither dramatic resolution nor profound revelation, simply continuing engagement with life as it presented itself in all its complicated, mundane, occasionally transcendent reality. And in that continuing engagement lay not conclusion but invitation, not finality but ongoing possibility, not arrival but journey, sustained through curiosity and commitment, despite inevitable setbacks and disappointments. Not because suffering had revealed inherent purpose or abandoned hopes, had revealed disguised opportunity, but because capacity for renewal represented fundamental human birthright, available regardless of circumstance or condition. The understanding arrived not as dramatic insight, but as quiet recognition of truth already known, though previously unarticulated, that healing occurred not through external validation or material provision, but through internal integration of experience into coherent self-understanding, capable of embracing complexity without surrendering discernment. That genuine reclamation involved not recovery of previous identity, but creation of new integration, capable of honoring past experiences while remaining primarily oriented toward present engagement and future possibility. As moonlight gradually replaced lingering sunset glow, I moved indoors to prepare for tomorrow's commitments, grateful not for what had been taken, but for what had been discovered through necessity of rebuilding. Not perfect healing or complete transformation, but sufficient integration to support continuing evolution without limitation imposed by either nostalgia for irretrievable past or bitterness regarding preventable losses. The woman who had walked into Richard's funeral 3 years earlier, straight-backed but internally uncertain, outwardly composed but inwardly questioning her place in the narrative, had gradually transformed through circumstances both chosen and imposed, not into unrecognizable new identity or idealized version of potential self, but into more integrated expression of essential qualities previously constrained by external expectations and internal doubts. What Richard's posthumous provision had offered wasn't redemption for him or compensation for me, but unexpected resource for creating something neither of us had imagined during our years together. A communal space where creative renewal replaced isolating surrender, where deferred dreams found delayed but meaningful expression, where individual experiences connected through recognition of shared patterns and possibilities. And in that creation lay the truest response to both his betrayal and belated acknowledgement. Neither forgiveness nor revenge, but transcendence movement, beyond binary reactions into generative action that honored difficult journey while refusing to remain defined by its most painful passages. Not because suffering contained inherent purpose, but because response to it revealed capacities previously untested and therefore unknown. 7 years after Richard's death, I returned to the church where his funeral had been held not from sentimental pilgrimage or ritual observance, but for entirely practical reason of attending retirement celebration for Reverend Thomas, the minister who had officiated both wedding ceremony and funeral service that bookended my relationship with Richard. The building itself appeared largely unchanged. Solid stone exterior weathered by decades of seasonal variation. Interior combining traditional architectural elements with modern functional updates. Memory of that tense funeral day remained clear but distant, like photograph of younger self, whose experiences influenced but no longer defined current identity. As I approached entrance, momentary déjà vu brought physical flashback of that earlier arrival. The sudden silence that had greeted my appearance, the judgmental whispers that followed my progress, the carefully maintained composure that had masked internal uncertainty about my right to presence in space that had once been partly mine but had seemingly been seeded through separation and absence. This time, however, I entered not as potentially unwelcome intruder, but as invited guest with legitimate connection to occasion being celebrated. No conversations halted mid-sentence. No eyes darted away to avoid contact. No necks craned to confirm unwelcome appearance. Instead, several acquaintances offered genuine greetings, inquiries about Crawford Center's continuing development, expressions of appreciation for recent community art installation our participants had created for City's bicentennial celebration. Victoria was there with her husband of nearly 4 years, standing near refreshment table engaged in conversation with couple I didn't recognize. Our gazes met briefly across room acknowledgement, without either hostility or pretended intimacy, simple recognition of shared history, without current relevance beyond incidental presence in same physical space. She nodded slightly. I returned gesture with similar restraint. Neither dramatic reconciliation nor lingering animosity, just mutual recognition of separate paths, neither requiring engagement nor demanding deliberate avoidance. Sophia arrived shortly after I did, having driven directly from airport following conference presentation in Chicago. At 36, she carried herself with quiet confidence that reflected both inherited traits and hard-earned wisdom. Her father's analytical intelligence, balanced by empathetic awareness, he had increasingly lacked in later years. We embraced briefly before she was surrounded by former classmates, eager to hear about her research in arts-based community development work that had emerged partly from involvement with Crawford Center during its formative years. Abby appeared later with her husband Mark and their 2-year-old son James, whose recent birthday celebration had marked gradual strengthening of our reconstructed relationship. Not complete healing or perfect reconciliation, but continuing development of connection based on present interaction rather than past grievances. She approached with genuine smile, leaning in for brief embrace, before transferring squirming toddler to my welcoming arms. "He's been asking for Gamma all morning," she said, using designation that still occasionally caught me by surprise, despite 2 years' familiarity. "Apparently regular parks are boring now compared to the art park at your place." I laughed, bouncing James gently, while he patted my face with sticky fingers. "The sculpture garden does have certain advantages over standard playground equipment, though I'm not sure the artists intended their work as climbing structures. All art is interactive if you're two," Mark observed with good-humored resignation of parent accustomed to negotiating between creative exploration and reasonable boundaries. As celebration progressed through expected elements, testimonials from community members, humorous anecdotes from colleagues, thoughtful reflections from Reverend Thomas himself, I found myself contemplating circular nature of human experience, how spaces and relationships transformed through combination of deliberate intention and unexpected circumstance. This building had witnessed both beginning and effective end of my marriage, had contained both hopeful promises, and their eventual dissolution had housed both celebration and mourning for relationship that had shaped significant portion of adult identity. Yet here I stood participating in entirely different capacity, not as bride or ex-wife or widow, but as community member with legitimate connection, independent of previous roles and relationships. Not because past had been erased or its impacts neutralized, but because continuing development had gradually transformed its significance from defining characteristic to contextual influence following formal program reception offered opportunity for informal conversation with various attendees, some familiar from previous connections, others known only through community reputation or professional interaction. I moved among these exchanges with ease that would have seemed impossible during raw aftermath of separation and divorce, when social navigation had required careful preparation and constant vigilance against potential landmines of judgment or unwelcome inquiry. "Eleanor, there you are," called familiar voice as I refilled water glass at beverage station. James Wilson approached with dignified grace that had apparently remained unchanged through passing years. His tailored suit and polished demeanor suggested continuing professional success, despite visible signs of aging. "I was hoping to see you today. The center's recent expansion has been quite impressive. Thank you." I acknowledged genuinely pleased at recognition from someone who had witnessed both devastating loss and unexpected rebuilding. "We're particularly excited about new scholarship program supporting professional development for women transitioning from caregiving roles back to creative careers. Very fitting application of resources," he observed with subtle nod that contained more significant acknowledgement than casual observer might recognize. "Richard would be gratified, I think, by what you've created from his provision." Comment might once have triggered complex emotional response resentment at suggestion that current achievements somehow validated or redeemed previous betrayal frustration, with implication that rebuilding represented fulfillment of his intention rather than transcendence of his limitations. Now, however, I could receive observation without defensive reaction or excessive analysis, simply accepting it as one perspective among many possible interpretations. "Perhaps," I replied with slight smile that acknowledged both observation and its limited relevance to present circumstances. Though I suspect he would have been equally surprised by outcomes impossible to predict from either his perspective or mine at time of separation, James nodded something adjacent to admiration visible in his expression. Life rarely follows anticipated trajectories, regardless of how carefully we plan or how confidently we project outcomes. He paused, seeming to consider whether additional comment crossed professional boundaries before continuing. "If I may speak personally, rather than professionally, I've always been impressed by how you navigated circumstances that might have justified either bitter resentment or complete withdrawal. Your response demonstrated remarkable grace without sacrificing legitimate boundaries." Compliment landed with unexpected weight validation from someone who had witnessed entire arc from privileged position of professional involvement without emotional entanglement, not necessary for continuing confidence or essential to self-valuation, but nonetheless meaningful acknowledgement of journey, traversed with deliberate intention rather than passive surrender or reactive bitterness. "Thank you," I said simply, accepting observation without either false modesty or excessive pride. It was never easy path, but ultimately more sustainable than alternatives. Our conversation shifted to current community initiatives before concluding with mutual good wishes and respectful parting. As reception gradually diminished toward natural conclusion, I found myself standing near entryway, where dramatic funeral scene had unfolded 7 years earlier, the specific location where James had announced Richard's unexpected provision, before gathered community triggering sequence of revelations and adjustments that had culminated in current circumstances. The physical space remained unchanged, the aged carpet, same wooden pews, Same stained glass windows filtering afternoon light into multicolored patterns across stone floor. Yet my relationship to this space and to memories it contained had transformed completely through gradual integration of experience into coherent narrative that acknowledged both painful reality and continuing possibility. Sophia appeared beside me, following my gaze toward the front of church, where casket had once displayed Richard's final physical presence. "Weird being back here," she observed quietly. I still remember how tense everything felt that day, how shocked everyone looked when James started reading from the will. I nodded, appreciating her direct acknowledgement rather than polite avoidance of obvious association. It feels like both yesterday and lifetime ago, sometimes simultaneously. You know what I remember most clearly. She continued after brief consideration. How straight you sat through the entire service, like you were bracing for something but refusing to show it affected you. Memory of that physical posture, spine, rigidly aligned shoulders, squared chin, slightly elevated, returned with surprising clarity. Not performance for others' benefit, but necessary physical manifestation of internal determination to maintain dignity despite profound vulnerability in hostile environment. I was terrified. I admitted offering honesty impossible during actual experience, not of Richard or even public judgment, but of my own potential reaction, that grief might overwhelm composure, that anger might disrupt necessary closure, that confusion might manifest as inappropriate response to unexpected situation. Sophia's hand found mine, brief squeeze, communicating understanding beyond verbal expression. "And now you're teaching workshops on navigating difficult transitions, full circle in the most unexpected way." "Not full circle exactly," I corrected gently, spiraling, perhaps returning to similar territory, but from different elevation and perspective. Same themes, but deeper understanding. As we prepared to leave, gathering personal belongings and making final farewells to remaining guests, Abby approached with sleeping James draped across her shoulder, his small body completely surrendered to absolute trust in parental protection, despite noisy surroundings. "We're heading out," she said softly to avoid disturbing her son. "But I wanted to confirm Sunday lunch at your place. Mark's parents arrive Saturday evening, and they're excited to see the center's new exhibition." "Absolutely," I confirmed, gently stroking James's hair with reflexive tenderness that required no conscious thought or deliberate intention. "I'll make that pasta salad he liked last time, with the little tomatoes he can pick out himself," she asked with smile that reflected shared understanding of toddlers' developing autonomy and specific preferences. Exactly those, I promised, recognizing significance of this exchange beyond its apparent simplicity, evidence of continuing relationship development based on present connection rather than past grievances, shared future rather than disputed history. Leaving church together, 3 generations moving through doorway that had previously witnessed both joyful entrance and solitary departure. I experienced moment of clarity regarding journey's continuing nature. Not dramatic revelation or profound insight, but quiet recognitions of life's persistent movement beyond binary categories of triumph or tragedy, toward complex integration that honored both difficulty and possibility. What Richard's death and subsequent revelation had initiated wasn't rehabilitation of broken relationship or compensation for legitimate injury, but unexpected opening toward creation that transcended both original betrayal and belated acknowledgement. Not because suffering contained inherent purpose or abandonment, offered disguised opportunity, but because response to devastation had gradually revealed capacities previously untested and therefore unknown. Standing in late afternoon sunshine watching Sophia help Abby settle sleeping James into car seat, while Mark loaded diaper bag and various toddler necessities into trunk. I felt neither triumph nor vindication, but something adjacent to peace, not complete or permanent, but sufficient for present moment and continuing journey. Not because past had been erased or its impacts neutralized, but because ongoing development had gradually transformed its significance from defining characteristic to contextual influence, in life still unfolding through combination of deliberate choice and unexpected circumstance. "Ready?" Sophia asked, returning to where I stood, observing scene with quiet attention. "Ready." I confirmed, stepping forward into continuing afternoon that contained neither dramatic conclusion nor profound revelation, just ordinary Tuesday transformed through accumulated experience and intentional presence into something quietly extraordinary. Another day in life being deliberately lived rather than merely survived. Another opportunity to create rather than merely endure. Another chapter in story still being written through daily decisions and unexpected developments that collectively constituted not ending, but continuing evolution.